Ruben, thanks so much for joining me on this.
Yeah, no problem.
Coming in.
Yeah.
So a fellow by the name of, I forgot his handle, but he messaged me, he DM'd me, and he said, "You've got to speak to this Ruben chap. You got to speak to him. He knows a bit about sidechains." And then I thought, let me check you out. And then it's lo and behold, here you are.
Yeah.
So it's taken a bit of time for us to sort of get together. You've been quite busy. Thank you for your time. And
no problem.
How's things going on your side?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Just a little busy, like you said, but we found a good time slot. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I haven't, I do, I have my own podcast with a couple of other guys, but that's not super technical. So it's been a while actually that I've been on another podcast where, talk about probably a little bit more of the technical stuff. So I'm kind of looking forward to that.
Oh, excellent. But your surname, is that Swedish?
No, I'm Dutch. I'm from the Netherlands.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. The origin, who knows, right? That's in Europe in general. It's all a big mix of different names from different countries. So I couldn't tell you if it's like a really original Dutch name. Might be German or something. I don't know. But
okay. And then I believe you have a mutual connection out here in Hong Kong by the name of Leo.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. Leo's a nice guy. He's he. God, I don't even know. I guess he came to Seoul a couple of times, just randomly. Not sure what exactly the reason was, but he came to the Bitcoin meetup there. That's sort of how I got my start with Bitcoin. I ran the Bitcoin meetup in Seoul since 2014. And he was one of the early visitors from Hong Kong, and nice guy, very social and fun to hang out with. Must have been a conference. I think he was in town for a conference.
Okay. So what brought you over to Seoul? Were you just sort of like traveling the world? And
yeah, pretty much. I guess it just drew me, I would say. Like, I was always interested in Asia. I've lived in Japan. And then after that, I got interested in Korea. So I went to Korea and I just really liked it a lot there. So that's sort of what drew me. And I had a good time, when I was younger, learning languages. So that was also just kind of the fun part for me, learning Japanese and then learning Korean. And I like the lifestyle there. It's just like huge. I was living in Seoul, right? So it's like super huge mega city with lots of things to do, lots of people, and organizing the meetups there was a lot of fun too, because it's kind of easy to get people together and talk about whatever interests you. So yeah, that's basically what I was doing there.
Well, as of late, I've noticed that the Korean television dramas have really sort of improved in quality. I just finished watching a television series called I think it's called Squid Game.
It's funny.
Holy fuck.
So Netflix been recommending it to me.
I only got through the first episode halfway, and I was like, stuff this. I came home after a man cave, and my wife is like, "You have to watch this." We binge watched the entire thing. It was great fun. Anyway, so you're the creator of spacechains. Could you go into that? Could you let me know?
Yeah.
What is this? But before we go into that, why does Bitcoin need sidechains?
Yeah, I think that's maybe even a better place to start. So I would say, very generally speaking, for me, I look at Bitcoin and I see a new kind of store of value and a new way for people to hold their money. And regardless of whether, Bitcoin is sort of the thing that I think we all point to and say like, well, this is the highest chance of succeeding. But I try to sort of have a broader perspective and say like, well, I just want there to be a really good store of value, whether that's Bitcoin or not. I think it's very likely that it's going to be Bitcoin. But I look at it and I say like, well, the ideal money for the world would be something like money where everybody has equal access. So that would require decentralization, basically. it would have ideally a minimum cost of use. So it wouldn't be, fees wouldn't be too expensive, but like that's all relative, right? Because you have to pay for security in order to get decentralization. But ideally, we keep it as low as possible, whatever low might be, given sufficient security. And then I guess inflation is also part of a cost. If you create more coins, there's more of a cost to it. So ideally, you even have deflation, I would say, where the number of coins decreases. That's not the case for Bitcoin. So in that sense, you could say like we could make Bitcoin even better in theory. But again, it's a trade-off with security. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a good thing to do. But that would, again, I think, create like a better kind of store of value money. Fair distribution, right? Like how do you distribute the coins? I think even in that regard, Bitcoin wasn't perfect. You could have, I think the distribution could have been slower. I think it was too lopsided to early participants. But it happened the way it happened. And I think it's very hard to redo the experiment. If you start a new chain now, everybody's just going to speculate to hell. And the distribution is going to be worse than what we have today. So it's the best we got, I would say. And it should be widely accepted, right? If you make a carbon copy of Bitcoin, and it's the same thing, but with a different 21 million limit. So we have 2 times Bitcoin 1, Bitcoin 2. We have a couple of those, of course, already. Then also, it's not really that appealing because you want the coin that everybody else accepts, because that's the best store of value. Because store of value is basically, I am not spending my money now, I'm spending it tomorrow. And in order to spend it tomorrow, somebody has to accept it from me tomorrow. And so that means automatically that it needs to be widely accepted. The one thing that Bitcoin does not, and that's because it's the ultimate store of value, I'd say, is it's not a stable asset, right? So that would be, I guess, one thing that Bitcoin would be lacking. So sorry, like this is maybe a kind of a long-winded explanation as to like why sidechains matter.
No, mate, but we got the time, and some conversations require these chunks of time. So
sure, yeah.
Liberal use, mate. You go on.
Yeah. No, I think it's also like it's good to set the stage a little, absolutely, right? Because like it all comes down to fundamentals, I think, and it's all connected to this. So really, we're looking at this thing that it like basically is Bitcoin, and fundamentally, this thing just doesn't scale, right? We have the way it works is you have a blockchain, and everybody downloads every transaction. Even a participant who starts participating tomorrow has to go back and validate the entire history. So any transaction that I ever made, you ever made, everybody has to validate. And if we assume that everybody eventually will be using Bitcoin, then literally everybody will have to be validating everyone's transaction. And ultimately, that just does not scale. So really, I think scaling and sidechains comes down to how can we preserve what is this kind of ultimate store of value or this ideal store of value. And like if you don't like Bitcoin, like I mean, obviously this is going to be appealing to Bitcoiners, but if someone has their own favorite altcoin and they think that altcoin is a better store of value, then actually everything I say should connect to that. Like it's not exclude, like all the sidechain stuff I've been working on, I focus on Bitcoin because I think that's the important one, but it works on any other blockchain basically, because it's a technology and it works on a blockchain. And I think it's, ultimately everything is going to revolve around Bitcoin. But that's sort of, I guess, interesting to keep in mind that maybe even weird, right? Where a lot of the stuff I work on is for Bitcoin, but it's not necessary. Like it can work on all the other stuff. So I focus on Bitcoin, but it's technology and you can apply it to other things. Yeah. But yeah, so specifically the sidechain stuff, it is sort of you're looking for a way to do more with the existing technology. So you've got this Bitcoin blockchain. You have to have this block size limit, whatever you put the limit at like 1 megabyte, 10 megabytes. Like, I don't even care what you think the limit should be. There's going to be a limit. And then after that limit, well, what do you do? And sidechains are sort of an exploration of, well, how can we do more with less? How can we not just stretch out that limit and just say like, oh, let's go from 10 to 100 megabytes and et cetera, et cetera. And fundamentally, we just lose basically all these properties that, I mentioned. And sidechains, they are basically a way of looking at it and saying like, okay, let's make some trade-offs that preserve what we have today, but give us more somehow. And one way of doing that type of scaling, I would say, is creating an altcoin. It's one way of doing it, right? You could say like, okay, well, I have this use case that requires advanced smart contracts, and Bitcoin does not currently support advanced smart contracts. So let's just create another chain, and let's put another, and then once you have another chain, now you have this issues like, well, in order for people to use the chain, you need to have a token. And then you get into this whole stuff with like, okay, well, I need to put a lot of time into developing the chain. So maybe I just give myself a bunch of these tokens, and then I sell it to the market, and I get a bunch of money, and then other people can maybe also get a bunch of money. And
congratulations, you just invented the ICO concept.
Yes, pretty much. ICO, altcoin, like it's all a very similar concept. And there are different degradations of literally giving yourself tokens versus mining, and then maybe people are secretly have some kind of incentive so they can mine better than other people, or it's the kind of coin where they launch it but then they don't do any marketing, and then first they mine a bunch themselves, and then after a while they go and market the shit out of it, and then they basically have a pre-mine equivalent without pre-mining. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can do stuff that is in my opinion fundamentally immoral and
illegal.
So yeah, but I mean, legality is sort of like, I would agree, but like legality is the thing we're skirting around, right? With like we're trying to create systems here that cannot be touched by regulation.
True. That's true.
So
yeah.
So you could say that, and I would like for that to be regulated, but considering we're creating systems that are supposedly, I mean, people are create them in such ways that they can be regulated, of course. It's not really an answer, right, to this question. But I think it just fundamentally creating an altcoin creates all kinds of problems. And like one of them, like very simply put, is okay, so you've got a use case and you want people to, let's say it's a good use case. I don't know, let's just pretend there's some kind of DAO smart contract thingy that people really like and it's actually useful. I could question that as well, but let's say there is. Well, you still need to have value within that system. And then the value is your speculative token that you used to, build the system in the first place. And then the question is, well, who really wants to hold that token? Is it a store of value? And fundamentally, the answer tends to be no, it's not a store of value. So at the end of the day, if that use case, the only way the token can have value, like theoretically, is if it's a useful use case. And after you've used it for that use case, you pass it on to somebody else who wants to do it for the same use case. And hopefully this goes into perpetually continues. So you have this sort of perpetual value there because of the use case. But there are a bunch of problems with that. And the first problem I would say is that it is not at all guaranteed that your use case is going to exist on that specific chain into the far future. And in fact, the way it goes, because of the whole pump and dump mechanics, is that you got this one chain that's popular, and then, okay, there's some value there because people are using it and people are speculating on top of it. But then everybody moves to the next chain because now all the marketing and all the hype is here. And so this one goes to zero. So what ends up happening is pump, dump. And you are basically within, even if you care about the use case, you're also speculating. There is no way you can do the thing that you're interested in and also and not speculate at the same time. So you're trapped in this, like, it's like you're buying a lottery ticket while you are doing the thing that you're trying to do. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's having your cake and eating it, basically.
It's one way of saying it, I guess. Yeah. So I think that's just kind of fundamentally problematic. And then, people do things like they use the token as collateral to create other tokens. And that's the same thing where it's like, well, if it's going to go to zero, it's not good collateral. So whatever you're doing that you can do because it's collateral, it's not going to last. And so fundamentally, and this is not easy to answer, but fundamentally, if you could do the same thing without having a speculative token there, that would be better. And that's basically, very long answer to your initial question. That's basically what space chains are about. It is about how to do an alternate chain without attaching an altcoin to it, and having the exact same use cases, but without all the speculation. And that was sort of tricky to achieve, but like at a high level, that is what space chains are. Okay.
I think the actual question was, why does Bitcoin need sidechains?
Yeah.
Okay. And you spoke very much about the specific implementation of space chains in this regard. I mean, there are a number of different sidechain proposals. To me, like, just to sort of elaborate on an even higher level, at least my perspective, is that a lot of the Bitcoiners, we've got a bit of PTSD from all the big block wars and the shitcoiners and all of this stuff sort of coming through. And I think it's kind of understandable. And this whole concept or idea of this, toxic maximalism that's coming about. To a degree, I think that's interesting, but it's also rather naive and I think might be immature in some senses. For the reason is that there is no better store of value out there, in my opinion, than Bitcoin. I mean, property is the typical use case of this, and you try and maintain property, it's a nightmare. So Bitcoin is just a private keys you stash away somewhere, and it looks after itself. It doesn't suffer from bit rot.
Sure.
So now, yes, going into a little bit earlier, you mentioned like you can build a bunch of systems that are pegged by or backed by certain things. You might have sort of like options and whole different sorts of our entire economy is sort of based on these higher level of financial constructs. And if there's an intense level of toxic masculinity, maximalism. Let's not get woke here.
Yeah.
What's going to happen is say again.
It's not our podcast.
That's not definitely not. Take umbrage on that. What's going to happen is that those things are going to be created anyway, and they need to be created. In my opinion, they should be created on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Do you have what's your thought about that? Because I mean, if there's a strong sense of push away, you're coming to fix Bitcoin or something like that, then somebody else will do it, and it won't be done on Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because I think a lot of these things are bad trade-offs that you can't really attach to Bitcoin without sacrificing the kind of store of value ability of Bitcoin. So I think for a lot of these things, you're right to say no to them. And in my own proposals, a lot of it has been very careful to not damage anything that Bitcoin currently does and still provide more features. Whereas I think a lot of the stuff that's being proposed and a lot of the stuff that you see in altcoins are way more dangerous and way more hurtful towards the kind of the store of value ability of Bitcoin. So it does not really apply to Bitcoin most of the time. And I think that's sort of where, there's this subtle line, right, of where it doesn't mean there are no ways to do it on Bitcoin, but the way you have to go about it is not the way you go about it with in like how all these altcoins are doing it.
I agree.
Yeah.
All right. So I've got a number of questions, and I sort of I want to interleave them into the conversation at like key points. And I think probably the next sort of way I'd like to go is like, exactly how did you come about designing space chains? What's the origins, the history of the project? When did the idea sort of start percolating? I mean, mulling around in your head, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, just very generally, right? Like connecting to what I was saying earlier, like I look at Bitcoin and I try to find ways to do more with less, and ideas come from that. And I look at concepts that I found interesting that are either there in altcoins or there are things people said on, Bitcoin Dev mailing list or Bitcoin Talk forums, whatever. And maybe it's like a loose idea that's like interesting, but doesn't really connect to anything else. And basically, I would say I'm a collector of these little ideas. And then eventually I draw a line between them. And then you end up with a new concept. And I would say like that's maybe how all innovation happens, because if you take the iPhone or something, right, when it was very novel, every individual part existed, but putting them together was like the innovation, you could say.
That's wisdom, isn't it?
I guess, yeah. So it's and I would say that's sort of maybe like what is my specialty, is just knowing a lot of these high level small things that you can do with Bitcoin or blockchains in general, and having the ability to sort of like put them together because I know all these things. And then spacechain specifically, it came from me looking into drivechains and looking at Paul Stortz's blind merge mining. And
pretty good work, that is. That's pretty good work.
I thought all the concepts that Paul worked on, they were all very interesting concepts. Like everything put together, there were things I didn't like about it, there were things I did like about it. But it was very interesting, right? So I really appreciate Paul's work, regardless of many people, they think like, oh, this is a bad proposal, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's a very interesting proposal. So regardless of whether you like it or not, I think everybody should appreciate that. But it seemed to me like the way in which Paul's proposal worked, the blind merge mining parts, I had an intuition that, hey, you can probably do this in a simpler way. And that is basically, one of the two parts. Like maybe it's also good to sort of like, it's hard to, I guess, get into it. But so the blind merge mining part is specifically, in Paul's proposal, was a soft fork. So it was like, okay, well, hey, let's just decide on this unique location in the blockchain, specifically Coinbase transaction. You put a hash there, and let's allow people to bid on putting a hash in that location.
Yeah.
And that's fine and all. You could do that, but creating that as a soft fork is like one of those things that just already makes it very difficult to get it adopted into Bitcoin, because now you have to convince everyone, hey, this is a useful change that you should really want, and you should update your software in order to get it. And I think with drivechains, sort of that's where it sort of got stuck, right? Where not everybody was convinced. There was not enough momentum in order to create a soft fork in order to enable it. But the blind merge mining parts, I sort of realized that given a few smart tricks, you can enable this already without a soft fork by creating a certain sequence of transactions that you can do them in multiple ways. Either you create some kind of covenant, or you just pre-sign a bunch of transactions. And then you let anyone basically outbid the other person in order to put the transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain and attach a hash to that specific transaction. So now you've got the sequence of transactions, of which only one per block can enter the Bitcoin blockchain. Anyone can put it into the Bitcoin blockchain, and whoever succeeds to put it into the Bitcoin blockchain gets to put their hash there, which is a hash that refers to a whole different block on a different chain, which in this case is a space chain. So that concept, it was sort of the first of I would say two parts that space chains consist of. And this gives you a mechanism that, again, is similar to like half of what Paul Storz did with the drivechains, but without a soft fork. And it allows you to create these completely separate blockchains, but it's still a separate blockchain, right? We haven't solved the altcoin problem. So, okay, now you've got this other chain, but how are you going to put transactions on there? What are you going to do on there? You should put a token on there, but if you put a token on there, it's going to be an altcoin. It's going to be an altcoin. You run into all these problems that we just discussed. So that's sort of the second part.
You're referring to the drive chains. When you create a side chain or a drive chain, you're going to have an altcoin?
No, sorry. So there are two mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
So for drive chains specifically, the first mechanism is, how do we create an alternate chain? The second mechanism is, how do we put Bitcoin on that alternate chain?
Right.
So these are two steps basically.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm talking about the first step is, okay, you create this alternate chain.
Right.
But if you just take that step, you have an altcoin, right? If you don't put Bitcoin on there, what are you going to do with that chain? Well, what most people do with another chain is they create an altcoin, right?
Like Namecoin or something like that. That's what you're referring to. Except that was merge mining, not blind merge mining.
Yeah. So the difference between merge mining and blind merge mining, it's not super important, but basically blind merge mining is superior, let's say.
No, I just added that as a FYI. Okay, so now your objection is that if you do have an altcoin, you're going to add all of the issues of having an altcoin. But I think Paul's argument there is that it's also fine to have that. It'll be you can make it backed by Bitcoin. Basically, his idea is that he doesn't give a damn what goes on in there. The point is
no. So specifically, like Paul's proposal is not to create an altcoin, right? Paul's proposal is you don't have an altcoin, you have Bitcoin, and Bitcoin it goes onto the other chain.
Okay.
So that's one way of solving it. No. But the mechanism that Paul uses to move Bitcoin from the Bitcoin blockchain to this alternate chain is a mechanism that people have doubts about whether or not that's secure enough. And that is sort of like, that's the big difference between space chains and drive chains. Like they're not similar at all, I would say. They're similar in that they're completely separate blockchains, and they're similar in that they create consensus the same way. But actually, Paul's proposal is technically, if the pegging mechanism works, where you can move a Bitcoin from the Bitcoin blockchain to the alternate chain, that is better than what I propose for space chains. Because what I propose for space chains, I haven't really gone into it because I tried to kind of separate the two concepts, but I guess, like the lines blur a little bit here. The concept I propose for space chains is actually, let's only allow you to move the token from the Bitcoin blockchain to the space chain, but you're just simply not allowed to move back, which basically means you destroy your Bitcoin.
So
and that is the mechanism I suggest.
Yeah, you're burning the coins.
Yes.
Now this is where I'm going to introduce. Okay, so I've got a question I wanted to follow up, but before I do that, I'm just going to write this. Okay, so all right. So by doing that, the first thing that came to my mind is that you're familiar with Metcalfe's law.
You would have to repeat it for me.
Okay, so for example, in the telephone network, the more nodes that you add to this network, the more valuable the entire network becomes. So, for example, in the sense of like an example is Bitcoin mining. The very fact that everybody is using the electricity means that you can basically take this thing anywhere, and it can use one of the most efficient forms of power to sort of scale up operations. A Bitcoin miner will work in Russia and everywhere else. And the same with like a telephone system. I can contact anywhere, or an IP network, I can contact anybody, and it becomes more and more valuable. So now by burning Bitcoin from the main chain, and that Bitcoin moves to a side chain, represented as a token or something like that, that means you're reducing the amount of trading partners in total. Am I correct?
The amount of trading partners on the Bitcoin blockchain, or
yeah. Well. Okay. So yeah. So you've got X value, 21 million potential coins. Just assume that they're all liquid. And if you take out a chunk, a quarter of it, and you just move it onto a side chain, you're basically cutting a quarter of the brain out. The different connections that can potentially go. It can only go one way, but it can't go the other way. So in other words, am I correct in saying that? No. Okay.
Sorry.
Why?
but it's a good question. It's a good question.
But why?
Why? So the first thing I would say is, the value of Bitcoin is not in the number 21 million. It's in that there is a limit. Let's say we woke up tomorrow and everybody found out that they have double the Bitcoins that they had yesterday. And so if you had one Bitcoin, now you have two Bitcoins. And So what does this do to the number of nodes, right? The number of connections in Bitcoin? Absolutely nothing. What does it do to the amount of value that people are holding? Absolutely nothing. So it's not about the number of coins that are in the system. That's completely irrelevant.
But back in 2005, all right, I hear you. But I'm going to keep pushing this
go
point.
ahead, yeah.
Back in 2005, I studied something called LETS, Local Economic Trading Systems, and there's a piece of software called Cyclos, which is basically allows you to spin up your own currencies, but basically it's database. It's a centralized database, and you can have the currencies in these forms. You can create different forms of currency, like time-based currency, or there's a whole different sets of types of currencies and rules that you can create with this system. And the creator of this LET organization, he wrote a book, and he said that he went about creating this because in his particular town in Canada, what had happened is that all of the currency that was in that area basically moved out of that thing. So they didn't really have anything to exchange or transact with each other. The dollars there became, they dried up. Yeah. And so he was like, okay, let me create this. So maybe your argument is that, no, those dollars would increase in value, right, in that area.
So there are two things that you're kind of putting together here, right? Yeah, because there is such a thing as divisibility.
Sure.
So if the lowest units that you have, let's say like in Bitcoin is 1 Satoshi, right?
Yeah.
If 1 Satoshi became worth $1,000, then you have a problem when you want to send less than $1,000.
Right. And in the case of the Let's guy, he's only got 25 pence or whatever, a quarter. You guys Americans use that. Good luck in subdividing that.
I'm not American, by the way.
Well, you do have a bit of an American accent there.
No, that's right. Like I deliberately chose to sound American, so that is
tricking
correct.
me up, you bastard.
I am tricking you. Yes. My apologies. Yeah. So, in a digital system, that is very easily solved. You just make it more divisible. Like there's no problem with that. So it's not a problem of the number of, it's not a problem of the limits, where you put the limit, whether it's 21 million, 10 million, 5 million, 1 million. It's a question of divisibility. So if you grant that there's infinite divisibility, then the exact number of tokens does not matter. That is not the case in Bitcoin. So you can make the arguments that if an extreme number of Bitcoins leaves the system to the degree where you now have 1 Satoshi being worth way too much, so it becomes difficult to send small amounts to people, that would be a problem. But that is also a problem you can fix with a soft fork. And it's also a problem that would occur naturally if Bitcoin just became worth too much. If everybody started using Bitcoin and Bitcoin became some, I don't know, crazy amount of value, then we have the same problem. Now 1 Satoshi might be worth too much.
Bitcoin already feels like a crazy amount of value.
Yeah, well, it's the world is a crazy place.
So yeah, okay, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, that definitely does counter the author of that Let's project, because you can subdivide further, and a soft fork can even add more decimal places. All right. Okay. So basically, whoever and I suppose that might create the incentive of saying, well, you know what, I'm going to keep my money on the main chain, because I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of value moved out, and then that the value of the Bitcoin might increase further.
Perfect. Yeah. That's exactly what I want. Yeah. I don't want people to move their coins to the space chain unless they actually need to use their coins on the space chain. If you have no use for it, don't move your coins. That is exactly why it becomes non-speculative. There is no reason to move your coins over to the space chain and then sit on them and be like, oh, I hope my space coins become worth more. No, that's stupid. Your Bitcoins are always going to be worth more because there's a ceiling, right? 1 Bitcoin can always be converted to 1 space coin. So the space coins will never be worth more than 1 Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah, I see that. And what sort of use cases do you have as a space chain? For example, in the drive chain concept, they've got this idea of ZK-SNARK stuff.
Yep.
So you can move the coin in,
Privacy
erase
coins,
the history, and bring it back onto the main chain. So I can see that's a very clear use case for me.
Yeah.
And also within the case of, for example, Thunder, the idea behind that is that you can create large block side chains, which eventually will be able to create, and they are optimized towards Lightning, and you're able to create a system which can lift up the population of the world onto hash time lock contract with routed payments or Lightning type contracts, and then you can collapse back down.
Yeah.
So like I can see it's a to and fro in each of the typical use cases that I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying, so in your case, like a lightning situation, you just move it out there and then move it up onto Lightning and then keep it on Lightning forever and ever? Amen.
So the first thing, which I mentioned before, but I think is good to mention again, is if drive chains work as intended, they are superior. So everything you can do with a space chain, you can do better with a drive chain.
Okay.
That is just a fact. The point of contention is that the trade-off that drive chains make is one that is bigger or more. It's hard to quantify, right? But it's a different risk trade-off, and it's a risk trade-off that a lot of people are not comfortable with. So really, this sort of says like, okay, well, we're going to do less, but we're going to do it with less trade-offs. And what we still end up with is some things that are interesting, but some things that also cannot happen. So your example was the privacy chain, where you move your Bitcoins to another chain, you mix them somewhere in there, and then you take them back out. That requires having the value of the actual Bitcoin on this other chain. And that is something I would say space chains fundamentally do not do, because you do not. It would be a silly idea to burn all your Bitcoins, move them over to the space chain, and then expect somebody to buy them from you in order to move back to the Bitcoin blockchain, because you cannot move back. The only way to move back is to sell them again and go back to the Bitcoin blockchain. And if you do that, you're going to sell them at a loss. So yes, you could do that, and you could have your privacy chain, you could mix them. But once you move back, you lose value. And that's probably not going to be economically viable. So you end up nobody ends up doing that, I would say. So really, the use cases that are left are all the use cases that do not require a store of value. And I would argue, I guess I shouldn't get into this too much, but I would argue that all the altcoins have that problem, because all the altcoins fundamentally are not a good store of value, in my opinion.
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree.
So my argument here is that anything that an altcoin can do can be done with a space chain. But that also means that I think altcoins are not a good store of value. Some use cases would be, the first one is very simple: asset issuance. So if you want to issue some kind of token, like the Blockstream mining nodes, for instance, that's an interesting use case. So this would not be a trustless token, right? This would be somebody who's issuing something, or a stable coin like USD Tether. You need to have some kind of function to create a token and then send the token over to other people. And traditionally, that's been like, either you do it on top of the Bitcoin blockchain, but it requires one Bitcoin transaction every time you want to move the token, or it requires an alternate chain, which is an altcoin. I guess there's a third option, which is federations, but federations, they add a trust assumption. That is, I think, also perfectly fine depending on your use case, but it sort of like deviates from the decentralization ideal. And so that is now possible on this space chain without requiring some kind of altcoin as in between assets in order to pay for block space. And it is still tied to Bitcoin in the sense that the space chain is tied to Bitcoin.
Oh, sorry. When you said asset, you mean ASSET, not ACID. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Forgive me. I was like a little bit of ambiguity
Yeah.
there. Keep going.
Asset on the blockchain would be an interesting one as well, but I haven't figured that one out yet. Sorry.
Okay. Asset. All right. Keep going.
Yeah. So asset issuance. So issuing tokens is what I meant. And so, this is like the colored coin protocols that you have on Bitcoin, but then on a separate chain. So that's one use case. And then you can also use that for federated tokens, right? So somebody could issue a two-way peg federated Bitcoin on a space chain, which would give up the trustlessness, right? It would no longer be like fully decentralized, but you're free to do so. And it would be sort of interesting. So you have this decentralized chain, but one of the assets on top of the chain is not decentralized, kind of like that. NFTs, right? That's also asset issuance, basically. DeFi, depending on how you want to define it. If you have some kind of USD Tether stablecoin on there, you can use that as collateral for your DeFi stuff. Again, I wouldn't say that's trustless, but that's one way of doing it. DNS is another one of those use cases where maybe you want to have some kind of decentralized registry for your URLs. And now you could do that like Namecoin, right? The Namecoin example, but without the Namecoin token. And I would argue that is superior ultimately. If you can do the same thing without the speculative asset, that is preferable. Now you can purchase your domain name without also having to purchase a lottery ticket while you're at it. And then I guess there's one final use case, which is a little bit more of a questionable one, but that would be low value payments. So even though I said it's not a good store of value, I think there are some ways in which you can use a space chain to create some amount of payments a possibility. And one very simple example would be, given that you have a space chain, given that you have demand for its block space, right? People want to use the NFTs or something, they want to trade the NFTs. So in order to trade the NFTs, they have to have some space coins. So the space coins will have some value, but just not very much. You might as well use that value to pay someone 10 cents, for instance. That would be possible. But you shouldn't store that value there, right? So somebody gets a payment, they get 100 times 10 cents until they have $10. And then after they have $10, they better get back to the Bitcoin blockchain, because if they keep it there, eventually it's going to probably cause a problem in terms of how much value there is.
And you would get back to the Bitcoin blockchain by out-of-band market transactions. Markets.
Yeah, markets. You have to sell your space coins. And that is also why you are not guaranteed to get one Bitcoin back, right? You are guaranteed to trade one Bitcoin for a space coin because you destroy the Bitcoin and you create the space coin. That's all good. But once you want to go back, you are reliant on what people are willing to pay for it. So you need another person that comes after you that also wants to make use of the space chain. Otherwise, you can't sell your token.
Okay. All right. So the value transfer. So technically, you can return your value back to the main chain, but it would be in the form of out-of-band markets, which is also viable and totally legitimate.
So I can maybe give you one example that I recently thought of that might be useful.
Please do.
Sorry.
Please do.
Yeah. Okay. So people tend to equate Bitcoin to gold, right? But it's actually a flawed analogy in the sense that with gold, what you have is you have a lot of gold that is locked up under the earth that people can get out, but for a cost. And what this does is it creates it means the price will be put, if the price of gold goes up, people get more gold out of the earth, and that causes the price to go back down. So there's sort of a proof of work mechanism where gold cannot go up too much, because once it goes up too much, people take more gold out of the earth, and now the price goes back down. And that's something Bitcoin does not have. No matter how high Bitcoin goes, no matter how much the number goes up, there won't suddenly be more coins. Well, maybe there are people that suddenly decide to sell their coins because the number is so high, but there won't be inflation. Whereas with gold, you could say, inflation, it's all relative, right? Because within the earth, there is only a limited amount of gold, but it's not available for trading.
Yes, I believe this is the first time in the history of humanity whereby we've had something that no matter the amount of demand for this thing, the supply that comes into the market is actually the same. or
Yes.
halves every 4 years, indeed.
Yeah. So now to go back to the space chain analogy, imagine you have a gold mine where there's a tremendous amount of gold,
Right.
but it costs a very fixed price to get the gold out. So what this does is it puts a ceiling on the price of gold, because no matter how much demand there is, at a certain price level, more gold will be taken out of the earth.
Right.
And this is basically what a space coin is. If demand goes up, people will burn their Bitcoins to create more space coins, and the price is fixed. So it's sort of like gold, where the cost of extracting is fixed to 1 Bitcoin. Is that a useful analogy? First time I'm using it.
I think that needs to be cleaned up a bit.
Okay.
And bear in mind, you're speaking to somebody a bit retarded. I am a bit slow. Okay, so gold in this case is obviously the Bitcoin, and the extraction. Is that correct?
Sorry. Yeah. Well, no, that's my point, right? Gold is not like Bitcoin.
No, I mean, in this metaphor that you're using. Okay, so say it again for me, please.
Yes. Yeah, sure. So I'm saying that space coins are the gold.
Okay. So, and you use Bitcoin to extract, to get space coins, right? So now the space coins reaches a certain price limit where people will decide, okay, it's worth my value, worth my time to burn some of my Bitcoins to extract this thing. And then maybe the price of, and then you get more space coins, then the value of the space coins drops. Therefore, I'm no longer incentivized to burn my Bitcoin to get more space coins. So I'd rather just like go on a market, or I could go on the market. I could go on a market to get the Bitcoins at a cheaper price, right?
Yeah, you always go on the market first until the market is more expensive.
It's too hot. It's too hot, and then you're like, "Fuck this! I'm just going to burn some of my Bitcoin to get the
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I'm saying that's analogous to how gold gets extracted from the earth.
Right. I understand.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah. I like it. I like that.
Good.
Yeah, you can use that analogy or metaphor or analogy, whichever one. Okay. So now another question I wanted to ask you is this: you're European. Now Europeans tend not to do NIH. Do you know what NIH means?
No.
Not invented here. So not invented here is an acronym for it just means that. And typically it's used in the scenario. I'm not pointing fingers, but generally Europeans will tend to be like, okay, there's a group A, they have a similar idea, and a group B have a similar sort of idea. What will happen is they will tend to join forces, and make the likelihood of this idea coming together more stronger. Sure. Americans, on the other hand, Yahoo America, like we've got to do everything our own way, etc. They'll be like, no, let's create our own thing, like our own thing, and then reinvent everything from the beginning, from scratch. So it'll be a separate entity, which could dilute things. Why is it that you've chosen to essentially do NIH?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the way I look at it is that like for me, it's just how do we scale Bitcoin? And I think all proposals are welcome. Paul's proposal is welcome.
Sure. I understand.
We have federated sidechains.
Yeah.
For me, it's just sort of like, let's find every possible way that we can do this and just do them all, because it's permissionless. You can just do it. Depending on like if you need to change to Bitcoin, like that becomes more difficult. But if you don't need to change to Bitcoin, like a federated sidechain, anyone can start a federated sidechain. So to me, it's like, okay, the more federated sidechains we have, the better, right? And in the same way, space chains are one way of doing it. And it's a different set of trade-offs that might be useful for certain use cases, might be less useful for other use cases. So yeah, again, let's just do that. And so for me, it's just the things that like I've worked on, like space chains and some of the other things, are things that did not exist before, trade-offs that had not been made before. And therefore, I think they're worth pursuing, regardless of whether they work out or not. It's a mentality of let's try what we can try, basically.
Okay, I see. All right.
That's so specific
tough,
to this.
Yeah. It's also quite tough because, you know, like in this scenario, in this situation, it really does come down to like, you know, like if we sort of dilute or make our energy go in multiple different ways, it's essentially, okay, so imagine if you got like a body over here, and then you apply energy in this direction, this way, all of these different directions, the ball's just going to jiggle around a little bit, you know, and then it won't move very far from the original source. Whereas if you take, and there is only a limited amount of people in the sidechain communities on Bitcoin, if they sort of they all gather around the best idea, and then they all focus on this, the ball will move a lot further in one direction. You're aligning all the energy. Sure, maybe not everybody's happy with their particular idea, but you know, like if everybody sort of gets together and says, okay, we make some trade-offs, at least we're moving in a roughly approximately the right direction. And the main reason is that this sort of stuff requires education, man. It's not just that group of people. It's a lot of people in Bitcoin, and it requires education. It requires this sort of stuff, and it requires concerted effort to get a number of people all in this and looking in the same direction.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, having said that, do you see validity in what I just said?
Sort of. I think the problem with that is that it's sort of idealism to say like, well, if only everybody pointed their finger in the same direction. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, how are you going to get everybody to point their finger in the same direction? That's kind of the problem here. So I think ultimately that is nice, but just sort of impossible, and something that I think in the past I had ideas like that, like this happened for the Bitcoin Meetup in Seoul, for instance. Oh yeah. Where we like initially I sort of was very idealistic, and I was like, hey guys, we all like Bitcoin. Let's all move into the same direction, do the same thing. But then turns out there were a bunch of altcoiners within the group of the Bitcoin group, and you know they split off, and you know, like it became like eventually it just didn't work, right? So, and at the time I was trying really hard, like to keep everyone together and be like, no, we should all, you know, if we all move in the same direction, it's better. So, you know, I was sort of in that camp, and I just realized the impossibility of it, I would say. So while I agree that would be nice, I also know that it's sort of just something you can't have any control over. Yeah, I had a similar sort of experience with the hackerspace out here. There's nothing as reality checking as, you know, trying to herd a bunch of cats or hackers and trying to get them going in one direction. It's like, oh fuck, that didn't work. No, it's very much the approach that I take is I move where I think I should move, and I welcome other people who want to move with me. Right. But I'm not going to spend energy trying to make other people not move where I think they should be moving. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to sort of like address the NIH question. So be it. All right. Do you have any sort of implementations of this? Spacechains have no implementation currently. There are a couple of. There's one way of doing it which requires a soft fork, which is the ideal way of doing it. Could you? Okay, let's go into the more details about this now. Sure. Yeah. So there's this soft fork in the works called AnyPrevOut. And this is basically a soft fork that is mainly intended for the Lightning Network in order to create Lightning channel factories where you can have multiple Lightning channels within one single UTXO, so multiple participants. And it just generally makes the Lightning Network more safe because you no longer have this mechanism where you have to punish someone. And instead, you can sort of overwrite. If someone sends a wrong state to the Bitcoin blockchain, you can overwrite it with the correct state. So this change coincidentally also enables a limited form of covenants for Bitcoin. And with this limited form of covenants, we can create this spacechains transaction mechanism that I described earlier. So now it turns out there are a couple of ways in which we can do it even without the soft fork. But those mechanisms they all come with certain downsides. And this gets a little bit too much into the weeds. So I don't know if I should go into it now.
I like it. I like it. I like weeds.
Okay, well, yeah, well, so one of the mechanisms, I mean, part of the problem is that it's also very difficult to explain without like pen and paper. But at a high level, one of the issues is that one of the mechanisms that you can do is you just pre-create all these transactions. But then what ends up happening is that one person has to pay all the fees ahead of time for all these transactions. So this ends up being, because there's no end date. Theoretically, there's no end date to the chain. So theoretically, the number of payments you have to make ahead of time is infinite. But you could say like, okay, well, let's have this chain live for 4 years or something. And then after 4 years, there's sort of a hard fork moment where you have to decide, okay, how do we continue this chain?
Okay. All right. So, okay. All right. Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah. And so the problem with this is basically just costs. Like somebody has to pay like 100K or whatever. I don't even remember how much it was in order to make this chain come into existence. And one of the interesting things is that once you have the first space chain, all the other space chains can exist inside of that space chain. So it's only the problem for the initial bootstrapping of the first space chain.
Okay, so pay to who? To the miners, right?
Miners, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And there are some other unfortunate things. Like in Bitcoin, there is this rule where if you create an output, the output has to have roughly 500 Satoshis in it, because otherwise it's not economical to spend the output. So in this mechanism, you sort of have to have two transactions. One transaction is pre-signed. The other transaction can be created on the fly and has the hash to the block. And this transaction can bump the fee of this transaction. But this transaction, the initial transaction that was pre-signed, still needs to have a minimum amount of fees because that's the relay. Those are the Bitcoin Core relay rules. And the output that you're spending needs to have at least 500 Satoshis in it. So these rules they're not consensus rules. So one option would be for Bitcoin Core to change their relay policy and make it so that if you create an output that gets spent in the same block, the output can have 0 Satoshis. Because now there's really there's no cost to the network if the output gets spent right away. And that's the concern. If you create an output that never gets spent because it has so few Satoshis in it that spending it costs more than creating it. But we're actually not creating an output because it's spent in the same block. So that would be sort of one of the solutions, but this would require a non-soft fork change to Bitcoin, but still a change. So it's not the easiest thing to do, especially these like transaction relay policy stuff. It's very complicated. I'm probably going to be talking to people about this in the next couple of weeks and see if we can come up with something. But that would be one way of doing it. Then there is another way, which is
even more complicated
to explain. So I'm hesitant to go into it, to be honest. But okay, at a high level, let's say.
Okay.
And this is something that like I recently came up with after like talking to a bunch of people about this. So I got some help here in the thinking department, where instead of having this sequence of transactions where first there's this transaction, then there's this transaction, then there's this transaction, you disconnect it. So you just say like, okay, you can spend this transaction any way you like. If you spend it the right way, you have created a valid space chain block. And creating it the right way means spending from the previous transaction and creating another output that can be spent by the next transaction.
Right.
But this creates the possibility of spending it in the wrong way. And so now you need some kind of recovery mechanism where if you created an output and now it's not spent in the way it's supposed to be spent, within the next block, somebody would have to create an output that can serve as the anchor for the next space chain block. And the problem with this is that
you have to get all the miners on board.
You don't have to get miners on board either way.
All of the miners on board, because the next, whoever gets the next block might be some other miner who's not running that.
So are you talking about the space chain miners or the Bitcoin miners?
Oh, the Bitcoin miners.
So very specifically, and something I haven't really mentioned, but probably would have been good to mention, this is the difference between merged mining and blind merged mining. With blind merged mining, you do not require Bitcoin miners to know anything. That's the nice thing about it. We don't need Bitcoin miners to care at all. Mm-hmm. They're just going to follow the regular incentives, which is take the transaction with the highest fee. And they are by default going to be mining these.
Fair
blocks.
enough. Okay. Sorry. I
no problem.
Yeah. Keep going.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it is complicated, right? So
no.
I always try to.
No, it's great. No, I
Sure.
had that, but I failed to factor in the blind merge mining aspect of that. Keep going.
Yeah. No, that's. I mean, let's get to it, right? Like, if there's something you're missing, just point it out, and I think that will be valuable to the listeners as well.
Yeah.
So no problem there whatsoever. So here, really, you want to have a transaction that can then be spent by the next transaction, but suddenly it breaks. So when it breaks, you have to create a new anchor. So somebody puts in another transaction, and you can either, again, lots of details, I guess, you can either sort of, I think roughly my current thinking, sorry?
You can tie it to that next anchor. How would you tie it?
Well, so you can create the next place to which to attach the next block onto,
right?
Or you can sort of create the anchor and the block at the same time. If you create
so you either create a pointer to an anchor, or you create an anchor. Is that what you're saying?
No. So either you create an anchor and a space chain block,
right?
Or you just create the anchor and then in the next block you create the space chain block.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, so these have different economic consequences. Yes. So if you just create the anchor, it becomes a free rider problem where nobody has any incentive to be the one creating the anchor, other than that they want the space chain to live forward. But who does it, right? Only one person has to do it. So everybody else is like, well, I don't want to create the anchor because then I have to pay Bitcoin fees. So I think that might be good enough for an early space chain. But if Bitcoin fees become really high, maybe that starts to become a problem but it also sort of solves itself, because if literally nobody creates an anchor, then the chain just doesn't move forward. So there's definitely an incentive, but it's just a question like who does it. And then there are a couple of more subtle.
Well, my experience with hackerspaces is that nobody's going to do that. Only somebody with who can be taken to court is the person who's going to do that.
Yeah. So, if Bitcoin fees are low, like it's not going to be a huge deal, right? And this is not the type of event that's going to happen often. It literally, like, somebody would have to sacrifice a good amount of value in order even to make this event happen in the first place.
Right.
So it's not like it's going to happen every day. And I do think you can sort of have some kind of donation fund where you just say like, look, guys, just donate here. And then I will just put up the transaction whenever it's necessary. So you could probably solve it that way. There are a few more incentive things I have to think about, like in this model, because it's kind of a relatively new model. But that might be one way of getting it into Bitcoin today without any soft forks.
Okay. So, all right. I listened to Luke Dashjr. Is that how you say his name?
Junior.
Yeah. Well, everybody says Junior. Apparently, it's not Luke Dash Junior. It's Luke Dashjr or something like that. I believe so. And he's got an interesting. Yeah, exactly. And he's got an interesting talk on how changes are introduced into Bitcoin, and it's a very conservative approach, and it's actually quite respectful of everyone. I think it's great. I after listening to those talks, I've walked away with more respect, and understanding of the consequences of compromising these things. And honestly, it's very refreshing compared to the shit that goes down in shitcoins or altcoins, who just wing it. They absolutely wing it without having any sort of like respect for individuals running their own node. Say?
I mean, they're not trying to create the ultimate decentralized system. They're trying to create a system that is, looks decentralized enough so regulators leave them alone. That is the goal. It's not like, it's a different world. Like it's an affinity scam in the sense that they claim to do the same thing Bitcoin does, but they're just not doing the same thing.
Right. But, and for example, like, the respect for the individual node operator goes to the degree whereby like even new features that are introduced into the blockchain, basically they're disabled by default. And, the other day, a couple of weeks ago, I was writing some code, which actually required one of these features on the Bitcoin blockchain, but that was defaulted off. So I ran this code and I basically was like pinging all these nodes, all these Bitcoin nodes on mainnet for anybody who enabled this one feature, which was the filters feature, right? To get this these filters. I couldn't find one individual node out there that actually had enabled this shit. So it's like humanity advances from one catastrophe to the next catastrophe, right? We need to have some sort of like massive thing before everybody upgrades and like, enables all the stuff. It's like, okay, maybe we've got a problem here. Says the programmer side of me.
No.
And then there's the other side of me who says like, no, this is the right way to do it.
Yeah. So I guess, the thought I have about that is like, I totally understand it, right? But it is sort of it is a mindset that is not compatible with decentralization to demand that people just make or expect that people make these changes and upgrade their software and have all the latest fancy stuff that you like. So it is, I would say, the way to look at it. And I think that's a difficult way, right? Like people look at it and they get upset, they get frustrated. They're like, why doesn't this decentralized system that nobody's responsible for not do the thing that I wanted to do? Right. That's basically,
that's what it's boiling it down to. Exactly. Yeah. I'm like the old man shouting at the clouds, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, but like the problem is people don't see it that way, right? People see it as like, no, there is someone responsible and somebody, these core developers, they need to fix their shit. Like that's how they look at it. So there's a disconnect, right? And I think especially because Bitcoin is so fundamentally different, it is very difficult to switch that mindset. And it is also very painful when you look at all these altcoins that do all these crazy things and change everything, like you were saying. And then why can't Bitcoin do those things, right? Why can't we just ... And well, it's because nobody's responsible, and you can't just, it's sort of like what we were saying earlier. It's like, let's have everybody point in the same direction. It's like, well, good luck getting them to point in the same direction. Like, how are you going to do it? You can't.
So like in computer security, there's these concepts of like, WASP, or basically they're just like lists of best practices that one can do. I would imagine that like it might be a good idea to create these, maybe there are these sorts of lists that are available saying like, okay, these are the latest features and this is how you would enable them if you want to enable this new sort of feature, like, like the filters for Bitcoin. I'd love to know if anybody knows about that. Maybe, do you know about anything like that?
I mean, there is always a list of changes with every release of Bitcoin Core.
Yeah, it's not good enough, eh? It's not good enough. It's like, like if you want to enable this sort of stuff, then these are the features that you want to, and this is what your config file would look like for you when you run your Bitcoin D node. That's
the general answer here is also like, if you think it's a problem, go ahead and create a solution. Right?
Yeah, and it's
open source.
Yeah. No,
I understand that you will probably not end up doing something like that, but again, like who are you telling? Yeah, right. Who are you talking to?
Well, I mean, no. I ended up having to run my own node and enabling this shit myself, and then I'm like, fuck it.
Yeah.
But I could do that, so that's That's the thing. That's the solution.
But look, I do understand the frustration, right? Like I can definitely relate to it. I can see how people find it difficult. But it's sort of just the cost of decentralization, I would say. And at a very extreme level, right, we might end up at this point where more and more things
ossify.
More and more people want things to change,
but
nothing is changing, right? Ossification, basically.
Right.
And maybe at that point, it will even create a fork of Bitcoin where people are so fed up and things just do not change, where it just becomes this really like this big boiling point. And then eventually something does change, right? Like either it's like, okay, the pressure is so high now. Okay, now we can, and that's how you get consensus too, in a way, right? You get consensus when everybody is so desperate that they're willing to take action. So I see this as sort of this back and forth, right? Where you have to be frustrated first, and only when you're sufficiently frustrated, people and everybody else is frustrated, then we get action.
Let's have a war, god damn it! Let's have a big block war, and then we're like, oh yeah, okay, and now we learned the lessons there, right? Okay.
But the war is sort of inevitable, I think, right? You need to get to that level, and everything needs to be heated, and then people take action. So
yeah. So I'm all for ossification of Bitcoin, the base layer. I'm all for that. I'd love to see that, but I'd love to see a sane way to sort of lift up onto layer twos. I think that would be a really, really great way. What is it?
But just one thing to add, right? Like I think I see the ossification as something very similar too. I see that as an event that occurs naturally. It's not, you can't wish it into existence or wish it out of existence.
Oh, you mean you can't be for it or against it? It's just like a natural progression or evolution.
I mean, you can like it, right?
Yeah, okay.
Of course. Like I like you can like the fact that it's happening, but
it's inevitable, basically.
It just naturally happens the way it happens.
Yeah. So I wrote a question a little bit earlier. You said the good and bad of drive chains. I'd like to go into why you consider the certain aspects of drive chains rather controversial, what they are, and do you think that they're pretty good trade-offs given the circumstances that they rose up in?
I would say, like, I think I find drive chains very difficult to evaluate myself. I have put a bit of thought into it. Well, it's been a few months now, but like there was a Reddit thread where I kind of went back and forth with a few people, and I got a few, I guess, good thoughts on it there. But so the first issue that I sort of already mentioned is it's just very difficult to even activate drive chains, because getting everybody to care about it enough in order to activate it, that in itself I see as a problem. So just in the first place, I think the only way you can get drive chains to happen is either you do it in a way that doesn't require as many changes to Bitcoin,
right?
Or you get this sort of controversial moments where people are like, I don't know, Bitcoin drive chains edition hard fork or something, right? Like, look, it's possible, right? Like
the sidechain war.
Yeah, you know, that could happen. And like the way I look at these things is not that I assign a high degree of possibility. Like I don't think there's a high likelihood that it's going to happen. But the way I like to think about these things is that you sort of have to keep the possibilities in mind and just prepare for every potential future, and not just be like, you know, I think there's a 70% chance that transaction fees are going to be high enough in the future. Therefore, I'm not going to think about what happens if transaction fees are not high enough in the future. I think like, well, even the 30% case is something you should prepare for. So even if you think it's unlikely, you better prepare for the situation where it does happen. And then if it never happens, great. You don't need your contingency, and you know, the things you thought about end up not being important, but not thinking about it at all is sort of, you know, the other extreme. So the first question is just how to activate it. And then the second is sort of this problem of, so maybe before I go into the problem, maybe it's good for me to describe kind of how drive chains work and what they do at a high level.
Great.
So
that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So with drive chains, it's really two mechanisms. Well, three, I guess, if you include the blind merge mining, but the blind merge mining is sort of secondary to it. Like, it doesn't really matter how you get consensus on the other chain. You can have any chain. It could be a separate proof of work, and it would still work. But really, what you're doing with drive chains is you're giving your coins to miners, and you just say, like, here you go, miners. I trust you to hold these coins into custody and only give them out when they're supposed to be given out, as by the rules of this other chain that I'm now pointing to. And so this is sort of this like promise that Bitcoin miners could make. And they could just say, like, okay, yeah, I promise that if somebody tries to spend these coins in a way that they're not supposed to be spent, so specifically, this is a peg out, right? So you move your coins to another chain, and then you want to move back. So moving your coins to the chain is giving your coins to the miners. Then moving back is asking the miners, hey, can I get my coins back? And then the miners will either say yes or they will say no, and you can trust them to make that decision. So the rationale here is that, well, miners are going to be honest because they get the fees from this other chain. So they prefer to keep the chain alive as opposed to steal from it. And if that's not the case, well, then the chain should just die. So the second mechanism for making drive chains more secure is to put a limit on how fast coins can move out of a chain. So once you say to the miners, hey, I want to move my coins back out, instead of that being an instant thing, you put a time limit on there, say 3 months or 6 months or a year or whatever you want. And this does a couple of things. So the first thing is that, let's say it's an invalid peg out. And so miners are stealing from the drive chain.
So you define an invalid peg out as miners are stealing from the side chain.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So it's just a peg out that was not supposed to happen. Everybody knows it's not supposed to happen. And so what could theoretically happen when that happens is everybody panics and says, like, oh shit, all the drive chains and all the money that's in there, it's all held by miners, and the miners can't be trusted. They just showed us they can't be trusted. So the price of Bitcoin goes down because these are all Bitcoins, potentially. And then because the price of Bitcoin goes down, before the miners succeeded in the peg out, and because there's a time limit, you can say, like, okay, well, there's economic damage to the miners, because miners, they have to hold Bitcoin. They basically have sort of a Bitcoin futures contract, right? Where with their mining equipment, they're going to receive Bitcoins in the future, and these Bitcoins are now going to be worth less.
So it's devastating if the price of Bitcoin goes down.
Exactly.
So you saying that because you've got this like so everybody's on like watchtowers basically, and you can see that whenever there's going to be a peg out or money moving from a side chain to the main chain, it happens in very slow increments, and then as soon as there's an invalid one, everybody can see it for miles around, and then we'll be like, whoa, the miners are starting to steal, so I'm going to sell my Bitcoin, and therefore the price of Bitcoin is going to drop.
That is one assumption you can make. Okay. I don't necessarily think, like, I find this very difficult to really predict, but I can see that being one potential scenario.
Right.
But to be specific, you can't really automate knowing whether or not a peg out is invalid, because if you automate that, it implies that you're validating every sidechain, every drive chain, and the whole point of drive chains is that you don't have to do that. Because if you just validate every chain, that just means, that's like a block size increase, basically. You might as well do.
So it'll just be interested parties on that side chain that will be validating these peg outs.
Yes, and there are scenarios under which you can sort of create a succinct proof of the peg out being invalid. So you could at least share that with other people and show them. And so this is kind of where things get muddy, right? Because now we get into social consensus, where it's like, okay, well, Bitcoin miners are stealing from this Giga blockchain. Well, I'm not going to run a Giga block full node. So how do I know whether you're stealing or not? And then other people are saying they're stealing. And then do I believe these other people? Do I not believe these other people?
Do I even care?
Do I even care? Right. So if I don't care, then the price won't move. So it's not really a security feature.
Right.
But I think this is also, and this kind of goes back into like the second thing that you can do with this slowdown of a peg out is you can actually have a soft fork that says, oh, miners are about to peg out something that's invalid. Let's just say that if they actually proceed with it, we're just going to invalidate that transaction. So let's say after 3 months or after 6 months, the supposed peg out that the Bitcoin miners were signaling, the invalid peg out, becomes real, right? Like it takes 3 to 6 months. You can still cancel between that period. So if they actually go through with it, then from that moment on, the Bitcoin blocks are going to be invalid. So miners have to invalidate the peg out. Otherwise, they're not creating valid blocks anymore. So I don't know if you already see the problem with this, but the problem with this is that this is similar to what we were saying before. Well, if you're not certain about the consensus, if you're not even certain whether the peg out is valid or not, and now you have this subset of Bitcoin users that cares about the drive chains and tries to defend the drive chains, and you have the subset of users that doesn't want to do it because they ultimately don't want to validate this shit. Now you have again sort of a potential for a network split, I would say, where people are,
if it's large enough, indeed.
If it's large enough, and I could see potentially there being a scenario where there's a group of people that wants to do the drive chain thing and wants to protect the drive chain thing with UASFs, with soft forks. And there's a group of people that absolutely does not want to do it. And I would say, very generally speaking, Bitcoin is the consensus system where you don't need this stuff. It's not that Bitcoin is completely immune to it. There are moments where people have to make consensus decisions. But for the most part, you could have downloaded the Bitcoin software 5 years ago, still be running it today, not have done a single thing, not have paid attention to anyone, and be in consensus. But when you talk about these active consensus moments, that is a very different story. Now you suddenly have to do something. And so I think that in the Bitcoin system, that kind of thing should be minimized. And you could also make the argument that with drive chains, it's just not going to work that way, right? Nobody's going to UASF. And if that's the case, well, then I sort of like question whether drive chains are going to even work in the first place, all right? Or whether or not people are just going to steal from them anyway, miners. So, this is a lot of uncertainty. And I think the first problem with the uncertainty is just that means that it's very difficult to get consensus on this. Like I wouldn't be like, let's say I was the person who had to, I don't know, there's only one Bitcoin developer and it was me, and people were asking me to add this thing to Bitcoin. Well, then I would be like, I don't really want to work on a feature that might not work, that requires all these changes. If it definitely works and if it's really secure and it's clearly just, there's no downside to Bitcoin, then I would consider it. But if there is this uncertainty about it, it's just very difficult to actually get to that point.
Okay, so are you done?
There's something else I can add, but yeah, for now I'm done.
Okay, add your point. Add your point. I've written down my little point over here. You
okay, yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing I was going to add is that I've actually looked into how to do drive chains without these software changes. So it turns out, the first part that I talked about is giving miners your money. That's already possible today, right? You could just send it to an anyone can spend transaction and then trust the miners not to actually spend from it, and to censor anyone who tries to spend from it, basically. So that part is fixed. But the part that you cannot do today is the delayed pegout, right? Where the miner signals like, hey, I am going to send these coins to address X 3 months from now if nothing changes. That thing you cannot currently do. But it turns out that once we get covenant support for Bitcoin, which is either the any private chains that I talked about, that is also relevant to spacechains, or the
any private, what? Can you go into that? Sorry.
Any private. I mentioned it earlier. It's the soft fork for making Lightning Network better.
Okay. So sorry. I've noticed that like whenever I go or listen over these podcasts, there's a lot of information I miss because I'm busy trying to formulate a lot of questions. So forgive me for.
So basically, putting it simple, there are a few soft forks in the work for Bitcoin that enable simple covenants.
Right.
One of them is Jeremy Rubin's work, which is called OpCTV. And this other change, any prevalent, which is actually meant for the Lightning Network, also incidentally enables soft forks. Covenants.
Right.
So a covenant, which again is probably a difficult word, just means a restriction on how these Bitcoins can be spent.
Right.
So you could even call a time lock a covenant, right? Where you send the coins to an output, and then the output cannot be spent right away because it's restricted by the time lock covenants that says, no, you got to wait 1 week and only then can you spend it. And in the same way, you can restrict how the Bitcoins can be spent in other ways. Like, for instance, I'm sending it to an output, and this output can be spent in 3 months to only this specific address.
That's fair.
Or you can spend it now, and then you have to send it back to, in this case, the Bitcoin miners. So you can create a covenant like that roughly works like I just described, that mimics the feature that Paul Stortz had in mind for delaying the pegouts. And so once we get one of these changes into Bitcoin that are currently being looked at and are likely to enter into Bitcoin, we can also create a form of drive chains that is maybe not exactly like what Paul Stortz had in mind, but pretty close to it. And so now you get to this point where, even though I was saying there are certain possible risks that might be associated with drive chains, like I don't claim to know, right? I'm just saying there's uncertainty, and the uncertainty makes people uncomfortable, including myself. Now you get into a situation where if you really don't want this drive chains thing to happen, you actually have to also block these upcoming soft forks. And I personally don't think people feel strongly enough about it to block these soft forks. And so we're probably going to get confidence.
the golden eye, the blue-eyed, golden-haired boy at the moment, right?
Yes. I do think people should be aware that, hey, once we enable this, we're sort of also enabling drive chains, just so you know. And then people have to just make up their own mind.
But drive chains is also opt-in, right? You don't have to use a fucking sidechain if you don't want to.
Yeah, but that's the kind of there's a tricky line, right? Because you want the health of the network as a whole, you want it to be healthy. So even though you don't necessarily have to participate, it still affects you. It's like, another example would be, let's have...
it's the same concept as like introducing changes into Bitcoin D, right? You introduce them as a default off, right? I mean, it's affecting me because they're off. So it's like, you see what I mean? Like,
well, the status quo is always
both ways.
Well, the status quo is always the default, right? So that's how it works. If there is no consensus, then we just get no changes, and then Bitcoin is just going to be what it was, and it's never going to change anymore. Right. You always get like no is the default, right? The default is just it's not there. But one example would be like you could introduce another chain that has confidential transactions, for instance. Or like within Bitcoin, you have confidential Bitcoins and you have non-confidential Bitcoins. And now let's say there's an inflation bug and all the confidential Bitcoins, they get
screwed.
They get screwed. So now you could say like, well, I have non-confidential Bitcoins, so what do I care? But, back to your network effect story, or just generally, like it affects you, right? It does affect you. So I wouldn't say, you can just say like, well, I'm not using it, so it doesn't matter to me. I think that's slightly too simplistic. But, that being said, for me, it's sort of like, no, if this is the way we're going to get drive chains through these indirect methods, maybe that does end up, being a way in which we can test out these drive chains, and hopefully things are not going to go as wrong as some of the scenarios I pointed to. But at least there is sort of a path now, let's say. I don't know whether I should be happy or sad about that, but that's just kind of the way it is currently.
Sad in the sense that spacechains won't be.
Oh no! I
sad
don't
in
like,
the sense of what?
No, so I mean, I don't like, if there's something that's superior to what I've been working on, I'd be happy, right? Like the whole point is Bitcoin needs to be better than it is today. So no, that's not on my mind at all. No, I meant like if drive chains end up being something that is controversial to Bitcoin and causes problems for Bitcoin, which it might, then we introduce indirectly these covenants for a completely different purpose, and you end up getting drive chains. And now, because we have drive chains, suddenly the incentives around miners change in such a way that it causes issues for Bitcoin.
I hear you. Okay, so no, we should probably be careful of branching off on two things. So let me write down something which is okay. Now I'll raise that point first. I was worried about countries taking on Bitcoins and Bitcoin security model and whatnot. And then I thought, then it came to me, then I realized actually the governments and the states and whatnot, they're actually pretty thick as pig shit, to the point where these guys would be happy to adopt, like something like proof of stake coin or something like that. They wouldn't even know how to attack a proof of stake coin. Do you see what I mean? So it's like, yes, it's good reasoning as a cryptographer or crypto analyst looking at these systems and like, yeah, it's going to be bulletproof. But then at the same time, it's like, yeah, these people, the state isn't as strong as we thought it was.
Yeah.
But now we go on a slippery slope, you see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
So where are the principles? Where do we say like this is okay?
Yeah,
I know. And the second point before I raise this, thieves, drug dealers, politicians, the good worker on the street, everybody wants Bitcoin to succeed. Everybody, except for the shitcoiners, right? Everybody wants Bitcoin to succeed. So
the shitcoiners too, actually, they're converting their shitcoins to Bitcoin secretly while they're selling.
There you go.
Yeah.
So here we're in a situation whereby you could even do things like drive chains, and I believe that people will find a way to make Bitcoin succeed, even if drive chains does cause X controversial thing, Y controversial thing, which leads me to my last point that I wrote down over there. We live in a complex world. We're going to have loads of complex different things. So complexity is almost inevitable with anything that interacts with the real world. But you're not going to get a complex system that's not built on a simple system. So it starts with a simple system, and then over a period of changes, it grows into complexity. Shitcoiners are completely the opposite. What they do is they start with this harebrained complex idea, and then they go out and implement it, and inevitably it just falls apart. So this is the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. It's very simple at its core, but then when you start looking at all the countermeasures and all of that stuff, then you start to realize actually it's an extremely complicated system that's evolved from this simple system. So I'm really not that worried about drive chain, these supposed there might be issues, sure, but hell, human beings, this system is a million times better than what we've got at the moment. You see what I mean? Yeah. Like, I think the issues that could arise from that are almost negligible, and they could just be solved by a few maybe blog posts or whatnot.
So I think that's sort of you're sort of describing the way in which Bitcoin functions and is secure enough as this magical thing that sorts itself, and we don't have to worry about too much. But it is built on people like me and other developers that worry about this a tremendous amounts and make sure that it is actually as secure as it is today. So I think that's sort of like the closer you get to the actual workings and the code and seeing like how many close calls we had with issues and forks and bugs and things like that, the less willing you are to sort of be like, I guess it will be all right. And while I sort of agree with that as well, right? I do, I do see what you were saying. I think that's sort of, the way I look at Bitcoin is like, well, is Bitcoin secure enough? I don't know. I hope it is, but I'm not even certain whether it's secure enough today, right? Whether or not there's going to be some kind of fundamental flaw that just makes it all break. It seems increasingly unlikely. But it's still possible that maybe this government's just completely cripple the thing. And a lot of the alternate views on that is, Bitcoin is fine. And in fact, we can make even more concessions and we can make it even more crazy. And that's going to be fine too. And, I think that's kind of sort of like the crazy perspective, right? Where like my perspective is, I don't even know if Bitcoin is fine. And then some altcoiner is saying, no, Bitcoin is absolutely fine. And my thing that is 10 times worse than Bitcoin is also fine, right? And then I'm like, well, like, where do you stand? And nowhere, in my opinion. Like, that's just kind of crazy talk. But like things are already not perfect. And the things that aren't perfect, hopefully are not like, hopefully there's a balance in things being good enough. But I certainly don't think that's ever an argument. And you already said it yourself. So, I know I'm sort of, talking, I'm saying things you already know.
Reaching to the choir, but you do
yeah.
also realize that as the host, I need to do a little bit of a devil's advocate, right? So
No, that's fine. Yeah. But that's basically my point. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so yeah, we nicely covered those territories. Okay, I think so have you finished with the whole drive chain stuff?
The drive chain stuff is done. I guess there's like I guess one thing I can add about like space chain still, if you're interested about that. So because one of the so what we talked about is like how space coins are sort of like gold, right? Where you have this burning mechanism. And it allows you to create this token. So completely at the beginning of the podcast, I actually mentioned that while Bitcoin is the ultimate store of value, what it's not is a stable money, right? It's not a token. It's not a stable asset like the dollar is, for instance. So if we think about the types of money that we want there to exist, right, from an idealist perspective, it's not just Bitcoin. I don't think that's right. I don't think we only want an ultimate store of value. I think you also need a token that is has stable value, because some shop owner that lives, or somebody who lives paycheck to paycheck, they can't accept Bitcoin, and then suddenly have Bitcoin crash on them and then not survive the next month. So Bitcoin itself is not enough. And then, some people think that Bitcoin is going to be ultra stable in the future when everybody holds Bitcoin. I think that's questionable. And I would say to that also, let's say there's a good chance that you're right. There's still a good chance that you're wrong. And I think we need to prepare for that as well. So even if you think that Bitcoin is going to be ultra stable, I don't think that's good enough. I think we also should prepare for the possibility that Bitcoin is not going to be ultra stable. Sorry, is there something you wanted to say about that already, or?
No, I didn't want to derail you. Okay. So my thoughts were like, okay, so I'll continue the conversation. You say if I'm correct or wrong. Using this new idea or mention of like the space coin being the gold, and it will find its natural price. You first go to the markets first to get a space coin. And if the price of the markets is too high, then you're prepared to burn your own Bitcoin. That process naturally arrives at a stable coin that you are able to do as a complementary pair with Bitcoin. And I'll go as far as this. Even if space coin implementation has just one space chain, that could be the complementary that could deprecate shit like Tether and all of these other stable coins. So a good use case for space chains would just be a stable pair.
Yeah, so that so I find it very difficult to answer what exactly is going to happen to the value of space coins. That might end up being some kind of stable equilibrium, but I find it very tricky. But so there's an alternate idea that is connected to this, which is where with space coins, you burn a Bitcoin to get a space coin. If you also introduce an oracle, and the way you would do that is sort of questionable, but let's say you burn one Bitcoin today, then 1 week from now, you don't get one space coin, but instead you get whatever Bitcoin is worth right now, let's say 50,000 space dollars. And so if you do it in a way where you can get consensus on the oracle, which is sort of tricky, but the way I have it in mind is sort of like you burn it today, you wait a week, then you get the price one week from the moment that you burned, but you wait another week to get consensus on the price from 1 week ago. So as long as you have a mechanism to get consensus on the price, you can have the same mechanism where instead of creating one Bitcoin creating one space coin, one Bitcoin creates the amount of dollars that Bitcoin was worth. And you can go one step further and you can do something other than dollars that's even more stable, like looking at I'm no economist, but there are things that are even more stable than dollar price that you could use as sort of a token value. And in this way, you could maybe create a stable asset that, like you were saying, is sort of like USD Tether without there being an issuer.
I see. Yeah. So, okay. So the initial thing that comes to my mind is that I think once, well, all right, I think it's almost inevitable that Bitcoin is going to reach like stability. I know you said maybe not, and the reason is because it's just going to flip gold, and once it flips gold, it's going to flip property, and once it flips property, there's nothing else to flip. It's just and at that point, it's just super stable.
It's super valuable, but that doesn't mean it's super stable. And so one argument against that I would give is that there are always going to be other assets, right? It's not like there's not going to be anything other than Bitcoin. And whether value goes into something and flows into something else is partially just the market deciding what has to go up. And the thing is, bubbles are natural. So I think what's going to happen with Bitcoin, regardless, like even if it's like ultra high, I think there's still going to be
bubbles, right?
There's still going to be bubbles. And the reason that doesn't happen to fiat is because as soon as there's more demand for, as soon as like, let's say somebody sees the dollar go up in value, right? And they think, I should hoard my dollars and even tell you what, sell all my other assets and hold even more dollars. Well, what is the government going to do in response? Well, they're going to print more dollars to offset the increase in dollar price because they want to create a certain level of inflation. So the way I look at fiat is as it's inflationary in order to keep it stable. So you get stability, but you get it at the cost of inflation. And I think we could mimic that within Bitcoin. I am not I'm not saying I'm certain that Bitcoin is not going to be stable, but I'm doubtful enough. And also, like, even if Bitcoin is going to be stable, it's going to be 20 years from now. It's not going to be tomorrow. So what are we going to do in the meantime?
Having said that, a few questions come to mind. So maybe volatility, we're referring to volatility. Volatility isn't actually a bad thing. Like the human living systems like myself, like if I don't go to sleep, I'm going to experience, all sorts of problems. My body will become volatile, for example. So
sure.
So, maybe volatility just sort of reflects a living system. And the second thing is, creating a stable coin that is not used and embodied by society doesn't sound like a very good idea. It sounds like you want to create a stable coin which actually is used by society. So something that
Absolutely.
that you know, people could go down to the corner and buy their bread and butter with. It
Yes.
sounds like the right thing to make it.
Yeah, if there's nobody using it, it doesn't even work, because you need people to want the token in the first place.
So then it's just a matter of these politicians in America specifically. Well, because the United States dollars, that's you know, everybody wants it. You know, there's a whole military going on there to enforce the oil-backed countries to sell their oil in the US dollars. You know, everybody needs oil. Everybody needs US dollars.
Sure.
So it's just a matter of time before Bitcoin gets into the purses and wallets of all these politicians for them to start saying, okay, let's start making US dollar as this stable trading pair. And now maybe if they start this space chain idea, then it's an interesting thing. Really, really interesting.
Start to use dollar as a
I mean, in other words, basically they transfer the US dollar system over to the space chain concept.
But that's
a huge thing, right?
Well, I mean, the thing I'm thinking of doesn't require government buy-in, right? Like my point is, this is going to be a decentralized stablecoin where there is no issuer. Yes, you need to have some kind of oracle, which I think is sort of a tricky thing. So that's not easy, but I think it's doable if you make the oracle part of consensus. So it sort of means that everybody checks the oracle, and it's not just someone who is in charge that everybody listens to. And as long as you have, you know, enough time, and you can find a way to get consensus. I think it should be doable for people to agree what the price of $1 was compared to a Bitcoin a week ago, right? As long as you can get consensus over something like that, you could theoretically make it work. And then it's not about governments like wanting to create it. It's about having an asset that, by the way, is still backed by Bitcoin, in the sense that in order to create these space dollars, you have to burn Bitcoins. Right. So the value actually goes into the Bitcoin system, because everybody who's still holding Bitcoins gets even more value the more Bitcoins leave the system. And so then you end up with these dollars that presumably, and I think this is a very similar argument to Bitcoin, right? Presumably people prefer these decentralized dollars over real dollars. And then even more money exits the system, where even merchants or even people that, you know, don't want to the price to fluctuate, and they're willing, you know, like Bitcoin is still the better asset in terms of how much money am I going to have 10 years from now. But if you have, you know, high time preference, I guess, or if you need to spend the money soon and you don't want any sudden fluctuations, you're willing to get the asset that inflates, right, that goes down in price over time, just to get that stability, and that value flows back into Bitcoin. So that's roughly how it works.
Yeah, actually, you know, I'm more attracted to this idea now, but
Nice.
Purely as a stable coin. I think just there's a huge utility just in that, to the point where you might want to even reconsider changing the name spacechains to, like, for example, I don't know, stable, you know, like just to get the ring across.
I would say that, but I would say, like, you know, that's the nice thing about spacechains, right? It is a base concept on which you can branch off in many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I look at that is, you know, it's sort of like, it's a layer on top of a layer once you do that, right? It's sort of like space chains, but it's like a variant, or I don't know how you want to put it, but sure.
A flavor.
It's a flavor. Yeah, it's a different flavor. And like, again, like to my point earlier, right? Like, I think all these flavors should be tried out. Like, we should just go in every direction we can, experiment with it, try it out without the shitcoin.
Oh, absolutely. But with the introduction of these covenants, it sounds like this can easily be done.
Well, yeah, once we have the covenants, then it's easy to create a space chain. Yeah. Well, I mean, you still need to create the whole chain, right? So, like, it's not trivial.
Okay. No, the insurmountable problem is getting the changes into Bitcoin Core.
Yes.
Everything else is almost trivial in
fair enough.
in comparison.
Yeah. So there is one more thing that I want to add to this, which is that So currently we've talked about a ceiling, right? So we've talked about how can we make sure that the price doesn't move over a certain amount. So this is either by burning a Bitcoin and creating a space coin, or burning a Bitcoin and creating a number of space dollars. The space dollar can never be worth more than $1, because once it's worth more than $1, more Bitcoins are going to be burned. You agree with me there, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the ceiling. But there is actually a way to also get tokens to exit from the system. And the way we can do that.
Define exit. You mean back onto the main chain?
No.
So
I mean,
where did we go?
Burn. We destroy them.
Oh, you burn. Okay, so now we're creating a tree, aren't we?
We're double burning. Yeah, we're going from burning Bitcoin.
You can keep going.
Sure. Now, I mean, that's also possible, right? Because you got space chains inside of space chains.
Right.
And then you have to burn space coins to get the space coins into the next level. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about burning them where they're literally gone. And basically the way this works is, I don't know if you're familiar with like a recent change that Ethereum made, EIP 1599 or something.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, they're burning everything now.
Yeah, they're burning everything.
Yeah, okay. They want to create this artificial number go up. So let's burn it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's there's stuff that you can say about the way they are doing it. Yeah. But fundamentally, the concept is interesting. And what you're doing with the burning is you're trading off security for token value, essentially, right? Because normally the money goes into proof of work, and now your proof of work is more secure. But if you were to say that, hey, I am secure enough, or if you were to say the space chain is secure enough, which, that's an open question. Like, I don't want to say that it is secure enough. But let's say you were to say that, and you burn the remainder. So instead of all the fees going into the space chain security, a portion of the fees just get burned. So this means there's going to be less space coins. And that drives the price of the space coins up towards the ceiling.
So now you have instruments to manipulate downward pressure and upward pressure of the price.
Yes, but one is imperfect.
And you say again?
One is imperfect. So the ceiling is fixed. The ceiling is certain, right? But the burning goes at a certain rate, and the rate might not be fast enough. So it's not a guarantee.
I hear you. Yeah. Yeah, which is what the U.S. government or these if they can print the U.S. dollar, they should be able to burn the U.S. dollar too. Whether they do that or not, I don't know. I doubt it.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, you just introduce a new instrument there to keep the value of this space dollar as constant as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. The thing is that now we go back into socioeconomic stuff. Like a lot of these stable coins were built using exchanges have funded it and done it, and all their systems are running on on their stable coins at the moment. So it's almost like it's going to be difficult to
so the way well, the way I see that is very similar. Like, so a stable coin currently, like USD Tether, is sort of like a federated Bitcoin, like even worse because there's one owner. So it's completely centralized, right? In that regard. So really the sort of thing that you're saying here is like, well, your decentralized dollar is competing with the centralized dollars.
Right.
And so aren't the centralized dollars going to win? Well, history tells us that somehow decentralized dollars end up being not so ideal. And my personal view is that the things like USD Tether are eventually going to go away or be restricted or have some kind of.
But if it's decentralized, it's good luck in trying to restrict or regulate
exactly.
that. Good luck.
I mean, it's the exact same argument as Bitcoin. Like, I would make the argument that if there was a government out there that was completely reliable, backed their currency by gold and never deviated from it, then maybe we wouldn't even need Bitcoin, right? But maybe everybody would be using that. But we know for a fact that we cannot depend on governments to actually give us that because the temptation is too big, right? Like you put your hand in the cookie jar, you eat the cookies. And this is exactly the same way, but just with a dollar, right? Like there is no contest. The decentralized dollar is better, assuming it works the way we want it to work.
Dude, this is actually kind of interesting because, like the simple bank account, you had the checking account and then the savings account. This is just like the check account, and the Bitcoin is like the savings account. You should get on a fucking plane to El Salvador, have a word with the president over there and say, look, don't use US dollars, use this shit. I got you covered, man. Something like that.
It's not quite ready yet. So might be slightly too premature, but
no, sure. I'm also being a bit tongue in cheek.
Sure.
Yeah. There's another topic I wanted to go into, or rather you wanted to go into during the discussion that we had earlier on. Now, I must admit, I'm rather intimidated in venturing into this territory. And
can imagine.
I think probably the entire population of the world would be, except for maybe less than 10 people on the fingers of my hand. So I'm going to ask you to please hold my hand through this. I know a little bit.
Sure.
I don't know too much. So the stage is yours, sir. Can you please introduce us to ZK-SNARKs?
All right. So this is something, like the reason I brought it up to you was, I like recently I've maybe gone on many podcasts, but I went on a lot of podcasts and I talked about the same things over and over. So I sort of was like, okay, well, I know this is a difficult topic, but let's talk about something else. And there is, I don't know if you happen to listen to, I gave you many links, so I'm not expecting anything, but there was a podcast that I did with Eric Wall, where it was just him and me talking, and we sort of just, paid no attention to the audience and just, talked to each other basically, without really helping anyone in terms of understanding it.
I love it. I like that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I that's not necessarily what I want to do here, but there's value. Well, there's value in that too, I would say. No, because now I don't think it's the right time for it, but because Eric also already knows a lot about it, that was kind of good. But I guess I could recommend that podcast. So it's on the Unhashed Podcast. That's the one I co-host. I'm not sure about the episode number, but if you search Unhashed Podcast, Eric Wall, you can find it. It's about I think Ethereum is in the title or something.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to get Eric Wall on. I think it'd be quite fun.
Sure.
I think I'm still too much of a small potato at this stage. Keep going.
Well, yeah, you'd be surprised. If you ask, people like to talk, so give it a try. But anyway, So you have these zero knowledge proofs or SNARKs or whatever you want to call them. Really, what it is at the end of the day is sort of, you are proving a statement to someone without revealing anything about it. So actually, a signature can be sort of seen as a zero knowledge proof, where I give you my public key, and then I prove to you I know the secret key that is connected to this public key. And really, I do this in such a way that nothing about the private key, about the secret key, leaks here. And so that's zero knowledge, right? I'm proving I know something without telling you anything about it. And so it turns out this concept can be generalized towards any type of computation. And so what you can do is, I guess in one article I wrote about it, I gave the example of a chess match. So maybe that's useful to use here, where I can give you a chess match that has been played out up until a certain move. I can show you the where the current state of the chess match, and I can prove to you that the way the state was reached was through valid chess moves. Because I could have just placed some pieces on the board and said oh, here, this is me and my friend playing, and this is where we left off. And I just pretended, to do something brilliant, but I didn't actually play the game, something like that. So the traditional way of proving that I got to that state is to just show you every move, right? If I give you every move and you replay every move, you end up at that state. And now oh yeah, you played that chess game. But with these zero knowledge proofs, I can actually give you a proof that says nothing about the moves that I made, nothing about the moves that my opponent made, but it proves to you that we reached this valid state on the board. Is that clear?
So basically, what I understand is pretty much asking yes/no questions to this thing. Like if there's some sort of process that undergoes, the output could essentially be a yes/no answer, a Boolean yes/no type thing, generally speaking.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess that's what it ends up coming down to regardless. Like it's all a bunch of logic gates at the end of the day.
The little circuits. So there's some circuitry in there. Yeah.
Yeah. But, like at the high level, at least, right? Because that's kind of the parts, I think, like it's sort of like people see these zero knowledge proofs as magic, right? And I would like, at least for the listeners, to sort of have it be demystified a little bit. And instead of looking at it as like, oh, zero knowledge proofs, they just magically do stuff that we couldn't do before. Like, no, it's very specifically, you move from one state to another state, and the transition has to abide by certain rules, right? In the chess match, it's how you move the chess pieces. On the Bitcoin blockchain, right? It's the UTXO set at state 10 versus the UTXO set at state 100. The transitions are all the blocks. So with a zero knowledge proof, you could take out all the blocks. And I could give you the UTXO set at state 10, I could give you the UTXO set at state 100, and I could give you zero knowledge proof. And now, instead of 90 blocks worth of content, you just have 2 UTXO sets and a 1 zero knowledge proof, which can be relatively small.
So you're proposing using ZK-SNARKs to solve the blockchain bloat.
So it doesn't solve the bloat. So in this example, it solves so-called IBD, initial block download. So the going from the genesis state where nobody has any money to the current UTXO sets, theoretically, it's not that simple, but theoretically, you could download the UTXO sets, which is a couple of gigabytes. You could download one single zero knowledge proof, and you could then know that that is the actual valid state of the network. So that would basically mean that the entire history of the Bitcoin blockchain no longer needs to be downloaded by you. And again, I say this is theoretical because the problem is creating the zero knowledge proof is quite expensive. And it depends on sort of like what kind of trickery you use. But in this case, because the Bitcoin system, and like usually when people use zero knowledge proofs, they create their system in such a way that it's easy to create a proof for it. But Bitcoin was not created like that.
Yeah, so good luck adapting, creating a proof for that, eh?
Creating the proof is the problem, and then verifying the proof, I'm not even sure, but I think that would probably be okay. I don't know, but I think with things like Starks, that kind of stuff is pretty fast. But yeah, just nobody could even possibly create that kind of proof. So that's sort of the problem there. But that is a computer science problem that could theoretically be solved in the future. So we might get to a point eventually where it is doable. And then you could use this for Bitcoin consensus to not have to download the entire blockchain, but just go to the latest state right away and do it really quickly. So that would be cool. And interestingly, that would not be consensus chains. Although, you could, I guess you make different trust assumptions because now you assume that the zero knowledge proof is valid. I mean, the proof proves that it's valid, but if there's a bug in the system itself, then you might have some kind of consensus issue. But yeah, so that would be kind of a nice thing to do.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And so this is the thing that are you looking at studying this? Are you looking at?
I have studied it. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess one thing that's worth mentioning here is, so the complexity, right? Like that I just mentioned, like it's new, it's complex. So for Bitcoin, it's really like not something that I think would be wise to add today. Because, well, I think the IBD thing might be okay because it's sort of like not a consensus change, right? And
there's always a fallback. There's always a fallback.
Yeah, there's always a fallback, and like people can choose to do it, and it doesn't really affect anyone else. Sure. So that kind of thing might be something that we may someday see in Bitcoin. Although, yeah, not anytime soon. Like I said, it's no way fast enough yet. And yeah, the way a lot of these other systems are introduced. Like one of the issues is there's a lot of SNARKs or zero knowledge proofs with trusted setups. So what that means is that
The
basically,
ceremony, you mean?
sorry, yeah, well, yeah, they do a ceremony, or sometimes it's worse than that even. But you're trusting that some group of people initially had some kind of secret that they threw away. And if they didn't throw it away, then the entire system is bogus. And they can cheat, they can inflate, they can break any rule they want.
So this is why I don't touch Zcash.
Yeah, so Zcash had that. Yeah, it's really it's a big questionable thing, right? Because sure, you can say like, okay, well, if you yourself participated in the ceremony, okay, you know that it's safe. Then maybe if a friend of yours participated, okay, you can trust the friend. But let's say 50 years from now, if we're talking about actual, store of value money, 50 years from now, nobody's going to know anyone who was even involved with that, or what their reputation was, or whether they were reliable. And so like the trust there is just very problematic. But that's also, I think, a problem that's solved by time. There are already reasonably good zero knowledge proof systems without trusted setup. Again, SNARKs is an example of that. So it doesn't have to be that way. But that is something we see with some of these very efficient zero knowledge proofs. They tend to make this trade-off. So that's sort of unfortunate. So then I think one thing I want to address here is that people tend to think of zero knowledge proofs as this great scaling solution, right? They look at it in Ethereum and they say, wow, Ethereum is getting 100x scaling through zero knowledge proofs. We should get that for Bitcoin. We also want 100x scaling in Bitcoin at no cost. But that is just simply not true. So the way it works in Bitcoin is, well, let's see, where do I want to start? Okay, so I gave you the example earlier of going from block 10 to block 100.
Right.
But within every block, if you just want to follow consensus block by block, there's also data that you can convert to zero knowledge proof. And the data that you can convert is basically, so you have UTXO, you have an unspent output that's being spent, and then another output is being created, right? So the input gets spent, goes away, and the output is the new state, basically. And then in between, you have the so-called witness data. So that's, for instance, the signature, right, in Bitcoin, yes, where if I send you some money, I put my signature on a transaction, the signature is the proof that there was an output that was mine, and now I want it to be yours.
Right.
So we can take all the state transitions of every input and output, and we can take them out, and we can put a zero knowledge proof there instead. And so what that would do is it would theoretically take out all the signature data, all the script data out of Bitcoin, and just replace them with a single small bit of data.
I argue, would it be small?
Yeah, so that can be relatively small relative to the actual data that you're compressing. And also, like, with this in mind, I'm sort of talking about like the theoretical, like the perfect zero knowledge proof, let's say.
Okay,
right?
okay. So the unknown, it hasn't been discovered just yet, right?
I mean, there are systems that probably can reasonably be implemented today, but there are different trade-offs that are maybe all not perfect. But those are all details that sort of, for this high-level conversation, I don't really want to address.
Okay.
So the point here is that the data that you're compressing is the witness data, and the witness data inside of a Bitcoin block is 50% roughly of the block size. So really, the amount of space that you can theoretically save is half the Bitcoin block. And that's nowhere near the 100x number that Ethereum is being mentioned. And so the reason this is so different is, well, there are two things. So the first thing is, in these Ethereum zero knowledge proof systems, the ZK-SNARK systems, they have address reuse. So instead of when I send some Bitcoins to you, you give me an address, and the address is a unique 32-byte number. If instead you just use a single address and everybody just sends to that address, then now I can refer to it more cheaply. I can just say like, oh, you have address number 15 in a list, right? So that goes from 32 bytes to, I don't know, 4 bytes, whatever you want. And so that's one way of doing it. But now you introduce, privacy issues where you no longer have these different inputs and outputs. And maybe there are ways with zero knowledge proofs to make that private enough so that no longer is an issue. But that would sort of have to be figured out first before you can, I think you can make that trade-off. But then the second and the more egregious trade-off that is being made in Ethereum is in Ethereum, you have a block size that depends on calculations and the amount of space usage in the block. But in Ethereum, the calculation side of things are very expensive. So if you have an Ethereum block, usually it's not that big because the data that is being put in also involves calculations, and the calculations are expensive. And so that hits a block size limit for Ethereum. But now what we're doing is we're replacing all these calculations with a zero knowledge proof. And the zero knowledge proof actually on the calculation side is quite efficient. So for Bitcoin, that doesn't really matter because the calculations aren't really the bottleneck. But for Ethereum, that might be like kind of a different story, right? So they are already more useful there. Yeah.
So you're basically saying there's massive diminishing returns that arise from attempting to introduce this ZK-SNARK into Bitcoin.
Yes. Well, there's not. So it just, as a maximum, it can save 50% of the block space. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, right? 50% is pretty good. But considering the amount of trade-offs you have to make to put it in the first place, that really doesn't seem like a good trade-off.
Okay.
And I want to emphasize that the 100x number is not correct because the way it works in Ethereum is all the calculations are being taken out. And instead, now the block can be much bigger in terms of bandwidth because you can either fill a block with lots of data and do no calculations, or you can fill a block that's much smaller but also has calculations. So really what it ends up being—
the calculations, you mean?
The block itself, right? So let's say you have little scripts.
So basically it's got code. It's got the instructions on how to transform the data.
So it's like you have code, right? And you have to process every line of code.
Right.
And some instructions are more expensive than others.
Sure.
So you can only fit this many lines of code into the block.
Yes.
Before your computations become too complex. Yes. Now, if you put in lines of code that actually don't have to be executed, but they just have to be, I don't know, you just read them or something. Read once and that's enough.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, now you can fit much more data into the block.
Right.
So what ends up happening is that in Ethereum, if everybody switches to zero knowledge proofs, and that's the only thing being used, now you have these huge blocks. So it's basically it's a block size increase that nobody in the Ethereum camp is talking about, where these blocks get bigger and bigger the more these zero knowledge proofs are being used. And that wasn't a problem before because all these calculations made sure that the bandwidth used didn't really go out of, crazy. But now in theory, it just creates even more of a centralization issue for Ethereum, and it makes it even more impossible to run a full node and get all the data. That's the trade-off they make. And that's why it's 100x, because now they can fill the block with lots of data that needs no computation.
Yeah, so I mean, like it's hard enough. Back in the day, I tried to run an Ethereum node. It was just ridiculously complicated. Sure. Yeah. Ridiculously complicated. So now what? You're going to make it even harder now?
Well, I mean, it's a trade-off, right? Because it is true that for Ethereum, the computation side of things was very expensive, and that is something that SNARKs can solve. These zero knowledge proofs can solve. But now you have the other problem, which is bandwidth, which at least for Bitcoin has always been the bottleneck. And I would argue, like, yeah, that's basically just always the bottleneck. So
don't know. I mean, is
yeah.
it really that bad? Is it really that bad that I just download, a couple of days worth of? I'm in Hong Kong, I suppose, but I'm a couple of days worth of gigabytes downloading. It's not that bad. If you look, if I compare it to the shit coins, it's insanely good. The engineering is extremely good. If I compare it to even legacy systems like the US dollar, I mean, it's in a class of its own. And I think people are giving Bitcoin unnecessary flack. It's just so good. It's really good.
And look, I mean, I don't have a strong stance on what the block size should be, right? So for me, it's like, maybe
I would make it
megabyte.
Less, I'd like it less. It's too late.
Yeah, now. I mean, but it's sort of like it doesn't solve very much, right? If you get it okay, so maybe Bitcoin could be 4 times bigger than it is today, but you're still hitting fundamental scaling issues. A quadrupling of block size really is nothing, right? You go from 10 transactions per second to 40 transactions per second. It's still nothing. So,
I think
it's not very interesting.
Oh no, I'm talking about the IBD stuff. Okay. I don't think it's that bad. Okay. Yes, talking about block. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I mean, well, for IBD, it's
I don't think it's that bad, really. I mean, if you compare it to other systems out there, it's
compared to other systems, it's much better, of course. That's definitely true. Yeah,
beat it. Yeah. I mean, now let's compare it to with the rest of the legacy systems. It's best of breed, and it's not that hard. You just plug it in, and you fucking wait a few days. Sure, maybe 20 years from now, you wait a few weeks, even a few weeks. So what?
Well, yeah. I mean, it is still one of those things, right? Ideally, we want people to just be able to do it within a half a day and just be synced up like that.
So that now we come down to the argument of being able to do decentralized, make it more decentralizable.
Well, I think mainly you don't want it to go up over time, right? So whatever the number is that you think is acceptable, whether it's half a day or whether it's a week, you don't want every year for that number to double, right? So as long as it's within some acceptable frame and the frame doesn't get worse, I think that can be okay. And what is acceptable, even that, right? That becomes kind of like a 4x block size increase kind of thing, where it's just not very interesting whether it takes 1 day or 4 days. It's just it's a number. You have to pick some kind of location, but the whether or not that number goes up, right, quadratically over time, that's the kind of thing that you don't want.
I hear you. Although I do like Luke Dash Jr.'s idea. It was just I think it was 32K. He was arguing for 32K. Oh no, 300K. Sorry,
300. Yeah, 300. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So I mean, I did those calculations as well, actually. And what it comes down to was Luke was just saying, look, currently at the time he said that, right? Not today. Every year it takes longer and longer to validate the entire history. And we don't want that. And if we want to scale it back to the point where that doesn't happen, blocks have to be 300K. That was his argument. And for me, that's just not important enough, because the way, at least for me, calculating it out roughly, what would happen is that, okay, 1 year from now, it's going to take longer to do IBD. Next year, it's also going to take longer. But then eventually, once you get 10 years from now, it's going to get shorter again, because computers get better over time, right? So it's sort of like this curve where, okay, IBD gets a little more expensive, but then it gets cheaper again. And do we really not want to have this bump, right? And just go like this? He wanted this. And for me, it's okay, well, it's fine if it goes like this.
So what? Okay,
I see. Yeah. and it's one of those things where it's not that he's not theoretically right. It's just, it doesn't matter enough for us to go and change a setting. That's what I'd say.
I suppose that really depends against what's the threat model.
Sure.
How aggressive is the state? at rooting out these individual nodes. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's also true. But like, I think it's we need order of magnitude changes, right? Like, if we're going to tweak tiny variables to make something slightly better or slightly worse, it's not worth the time and effort. It's not that there's probably a better number, right? Probably the current block size is not the perfect number that we, Satoshi was a genius for figuring it out years ago. No, we picked a number and here we are. And it's good enough.
He pulled it out of his ass.
Pretty much, yeah. And so it's funny. There's a guy who actually tweeted that to me. Just randomly said, "Oh, Satoshi was such a genius." I don't even know what it was about block size, but something like he was such a genius for knowing exactly what limit to pick. I don't know if you know Rusty Russell's Twitter account, where I think he's like,
he's the guy in Lightning. He works with Blockstream.
Yeah, no, but he's got this joke parody account, like stuff Bitcoiners say or something.
Okay.
So it's just a parody account where he just takes the most ridiculous things that Bitcoiners have said and retweets it, and just like, things like this, where it's like, Satoshi was so brilliant for knowing everything. Of course.
It's like, I suppose it's the equivalent of like stuff that Hacker News people say or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just like, a little bit too Satoshi worshipping Bitcoiners. But yeah, unfortunately, like I sent it to Rusty, but then the guy ended up deleting his his post. So I was like, okay, well, too bad. But yeah, it's funny.
Screenshot. Should have taken this.
Yeah, I should have. Yeah.
Wait a second. Oh, no, we've already discussed all that. Oh yes. Yeah. So do you see any other places that ZK-SNARKs can be sort of shimmed in or used to improve Bitcoin in any way?
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to add that connects to your question is that people also confuse these ZK-SNARKs with basically advanced smart contracts.
Oh, that's a mistake.
Yeah, it's not the same thing, right? The zero knowledge proof is just take some witness data and prove it more succinctly. And the thing that you're proving is maybe an advanced smart contract, and you need a language for that. So first you need a language, then you take the zero knowledge proofs, the SNARK, to compress whatever that language is. So it's not a simple matter of, let's add zero knowledge proofs to Bitcoin. You need a smart contracting language, and then you need to add support for zero knowledge proofs. And then you have something useful. And so the way you could get that into Bitcoin is possibly through something called simplicity. I don't know how much you know about it.
That's the block. But that's the Adam Back, the Blockstream. Right. And I think it's a formally verified language at this point now, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
It looks actually quite interesting. I haven't gone that deep into it because I'm just so sick to death of fucking smart contracts. But
so
please maybe I'm jaded and
no. I mean, that's
let me try to clean my canvas, give you something white to work with. Go for it.
It's a whole other topic, I guess, but I think it has a lot of potential and it's very interesting. And I'm looking forward to
what's special about simplicity.
So what's special about it is basically that it's smart contracts done right for blockchains. So it does a bunch of really smart things where, you already said it's formally verifiable. So that's a big advantage. And so you have this very simple language that's very simple to reason about. And you know exactly, you can predict ahead of time how much it's going to cost to run through the script. So you have because with Ethereum, you have this problem where depending on the state of the previous transactions and just previous things that happen on the blockchain, it might cost more or it might cost less to execute your transaction. And so because they can't predict ahead of time how much it's going to cost, you have this gas thing where you just have to overshoot it. And then you have to hope that it's enough, because if it's not enough, then all your gas gets taken and your transaction didn't even execute. And so this is not a problem with simplicity, although I guess, to play devil's advocate a little, you could say they sort of, it's not the most efficient language, right? So they sacrifice some efficiency in order to make it predictable.
Okay, but, you mean total?
How do you mean total?
Oh, total means that it's guaranteed to execute to completion. So is it a total language? Okay, so in other words, how does simplicity solve the halting problem?
Well, I mean, it's still like there's always a limit, right? Because you have a block size limit, so your transaction can you can't execute more than what fits inside of a single block, right? So there's always a limit. So it's never Turing complete in that sense, right?
Wait a second. It's never Turing complete in that sense. No. The language. Okay, so I'm assuming. Look, a total language is not a Turing complete language.
Okay.
So therefore, some problems are extremely difficult to express in a total language. But in a Turing complete language, you can collapse it down to just a few lines of code, and you can do some extremely complicated stuff. So, I see what you mean. So by being a total language, the complexity, and you've only got a certain block size, you're naturally going to be compressed. That's interesting. I like that.
I mean, I don't know if I'm following you, but
So what? Okay, so as I mentioned, a total language is guaranteed to execute to completion, right? So certain things are very easy to express in a total language, but when you go closer to like a Turing level, like a universally describing all right. And a Turing complete language, certain problems become trivial to express. For example, like looping forever or something like that.
Yeah.
So if
but you don't know how long it's going to take to execute.
That's correct. So now we got the halting problem. We don't know when this thing is going to end. So by having a total language, you know very sure that this language will complete the execution. Yeah. So now, when you brought in the block size, I questioned you. I said, "Oh, why? It doesn't matter. You can have. If simplicity were a Turing complete language, it doesn't matter about block size. You just give me a few bytes, and I'll write some code that'll fucking stall your blockchain forever, right? So in this case, and in this case, so by having a block size, you're limited to the certain set of problems that can be described.
Yeah. And like, I mean, if you had like an infinite loop, the cost of that transaction would be infinite, right? So you wouldn't be able to pay for it, basically.
No, I don't think I don't think you'd be able to describe the concept of an infinite loop in a total language.
I mean,
I forgot.
Well, no,
Idris. Oh wait. Actually, Idris is a total language, but I forgot how it implements this concept of an infinite loop. I think they actually introduced the concept of gas for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway, my memory's fading. It was a few years ago since I got into Idris. Oh, what a tangent! Anyway, oh, please, let's get back onto topic with simplicity. Go ahead.
So the interesting thing that they do is they take. You can actually take the simplicity language and you can create C code that is equivalent to what is written in simplicity. And you can prove that it's equivalent.
Yes.
But the C code runs much faster.
Oh, I see.
So even though you're expressing everything within the simplicity language, you can basically soft fork in speed ups. So you would, for instance, have a SHA-256 function, right? Where you hash something and then running that inside of simplicity would be pretty slow. But then you basically, because the way the code is sort of like, basically it's a hash within like a DAG tree, that's then instead of running that simplicity code within the hash, you replace it with the C code and now you run it much faster. And so you have this language that can describe everything, but it's not cheap. And then you have this verifiable C code that is exactly equivalent to it. So whatever you so introducing this never introduces a risk because you're not changing anything about the capacity of the system. What the system can do remains the same. You're just speeding it up by creating this equivalent code.
So I have a few questions regarding that. So you would first describe this. Let's say it's a SHA-256. You would first describe it in simplicity, and then would it automatically generate the C code for that, or would a human? No. Okay, human would extend the runtime to incorporate this, and then what determines that the thing is equivalent? I mean, so somebody's going to run this simplicity code, and then it's going to see, this function name is the SHA-256. And I say, no, I'm not going to execute the simplicity code. I know that there's an equivalent in a C function over here, C in this C binary over here. I'd rather call that. How does it know to do that?
How does it know to run the C code, or how does it know that it's equivalent? Okay.
I suppose both.
Yeah. So I don't know I don't know enough about verifiably proving that one code is the same as the other code. Right. So I couldn't tell you that. But let's just assume that that's true. So the other question is that's basically a soft fork, because what you have to do is the simplicity code still requires a bunch of execution. And then people who have the C code, they can do that faster, but you still have to pay for it as if it's simplicity code.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, because you can't assume that everybody has the C code unless you soft fork it in. So that's basically what you end up doing, is you create soft forks for the C code that replaces the simplicity code. And now you can make that simplicity code cheaper on the Bitcoin blockchain because it costs people less effort to execute. And
that's quite nice. And you're still able to earn the fees from that. So you're actually motivating the miners to actually say, well, fuck, I want to own a software. Got to update the latest. We can call them built-ins. Language built-ins.
Well, everybody would naturally be incentivized to just take all the C code that they can possibly get, right? Because it's just faster. But the question is more how do you reach consensus over what it's going to cost to now execute that function? And that's something you still need consensus over. So that requires soft fork. But the nice thing is the thing about soft forks is you need consensus, right? You need to change something. You need everybody to agree that the thing needs to change.
Yes.
And here there is no question about that. There is no reason not to run the C code instead of the simplicity code. So you can get consensus on the soft fork very easily, theoretically.
Yes. Yeah, it's like moving from the landline to the mobile phone, right? It's obviously.
Yeah. So, this is not my thing. I just think it's very cool. Maybe Adam Beck, if he happens to listen to it, he can correct me if there's anything I said that was incorrect. But I'm very excited about the project. And another friend of mine, Sanket, works on it too. It's a cool project. I think it's the right way to go about doing smart contracts. And whether or not it's actually going to make it into Bitcoin, I hope it will, but who knows? But it would be kind of a good way. And actually, kind of the thing that we're talking about, right, is the zero knowledge proofs, which almost I forgot. So how does that relate? Well, you could have a Stark or any kind of zero knowledge proof simplicity script that you then create in C, and so make it viable, because writing it out in simplicity code would just be way too much. And then you basically have support for zero knowledge proofs within this smart contracting language that could potentially make its way into Bitcoin at some point in the future.
Okay, now that we've got that, under the assumption that those two conditions are met, that you have a ZK-SNARK implementation in simplicity, and simplicity is a soft forked into Bitcoin, what can you do with the ZK-SNARK on this smart contract? With some simplicity, what doors does it open?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think that's very difficult to answer, because once you get to that point, you sort of already have an expressive smart contracting language in Bitcoin at that point. So you can already do everything at that point inside of Bitcoin. But it might still be cheaper to have the extension block model of having a separate chain, which has so it's just, let's say it's a second Bitcoin, right? But it's made in such a way that it's suitable for zero knowledge proofs. And then you can do your transactions inside of the second chain. And then the second chain gets committed into the Bitcoin blockchain. And this is basically ZK-Sync that I'm describing. And what that does is, without having zero knowledge proofs on layer one, which you could theoretically also do, right? So you could just take the Bitcoin block and replace all the witness data with a zero knowledge proof. But when you do that, you introduce some issues, such as, well, who creates a zero knowledge proof? Is this going to lead to minor centralization? Is this going to make block times slower because, well, I guess it's the creation of the block that might get slower. So anyway, there are issues there that you could kind of circumvent by doing it as an extension block. And I very specifically say extension block, and that's important because people have been calling these ZK-Sync sidechains sidechains, but they're not sidechains in the sense that all the data is still verified and it's still on chain. So you put all the data on chain, but where there used to be witness data, there's now a zero knowledge proof. And everybody validates the zero knowledge proof and the non-witness data. So the data, basically which inputs and outputs, which inputs get spent, which outputs get created. That still has to go onto the Bitcoin blockchain or on the Ethereum blockchain in the case of ZK-Sync. And everybody has to validate that. So I don't know if you know the exact difference between extension block. Do you know what an extension block is, or should I just explain it in general as well? Okay, yeah. So it's kind of an old concept. So just very broadly speaking, the concept is within Bitcoin, you can create a soft fork that creates another chain inside of Bitcoin. So you put a hash there, and the hash points to another block, and now everybody just downloads both blocks.
Oh.
So this is a way to create a block size increase as a soft fork, essentially.
Oh, I see.
And then everybody can just move their Bitcoins over to this other chain and move them back. And then from the perspective of old nodes, it's just like you're freezing your coins and then they're being unfrozen again by anyone, right? That's what it looks like from the perspective of old nodes. And so this extension block process, while interesting, has been kind of considered as sort of an indecent soft fork, because you increase the amount of computation that the network, you introduce something like a block size increase basically without people actually agreeing to it. And you do it in such a way that the backwards compatibility is less than ideal, because you don't really see what happens on this extension block side of things. I think, it's something I wouldn't necessarily say that it's something you should absolutely never do. But it's been somewhat controversial. And I will say that's not really the case here, because the extension block in this case fits within the limits of the Bitcoin block or Ethereum block, right? So it's more of, instead of having one block and then another block, it's having one block and then inside of it you have another block. So the limit stays the same. And this block can be more efficient because it uses zero knowledge proofs. But I call it an extension block because everybody is downloading and validating the block because it's inside of the larger block.
Oh, hell, I say fair game. I mean, we used to packetizing stuff, packets within packets within packets. It's a very normal computer sciencey topic, So let's not be communist about all this stuff.
I know the way I look at it is like, as long as nobody gets disadvantaged, right? And that's like when we create a soft fork for Bitcoin, we're always making sure that everything that used to work still works. Yeah. And so old nodes are not being thrown off the network or suddenly becoming second-class citizens.
The main issue here is agreeing to the contracts, not violating your contracts. The contracts means that we're not going to break something. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
As long as you don't do that, then the system can progress and advance. And actually, you want to do that, because a system that continuously breaks contracts is something that you just cannot rely on. You cannot build the next, system of the next economic system on a flaky.
sorry. Yeah, what you're describing here is like a hard fork, right? But there are also soft forks that can be, like, for instance, to give you an example, is we could decide to be like, well, you know what? Satoshi is too rich. Let's take all his 1 million coins and just censor them. And we're not breaking any rules, right? We create a soft fork where Satoshi can no longer spend his coins. And that's what we call an evil soft fork, right? Where it's like, totally yeah, you're evil. Not breaking any rules.
That's totally evil. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So just to point out, it's not just about breaking rules. That's what I want to say.
I hear you. I hear you. Okay. So does that sort of wrap up where else one can include ZK-SNARKs, potentially include ZK-SNARKs into Bitcoin? Or do you have any other subjects?
Yeah, I think that's the most logical use case to do something like that. Yeah, I'm not even sure where else to fit in these zero knowledge proofs.
Okay.
It also should be said, like, if you add them to layer one, if you add them just to the base blockchain, and again, there are reasons why you wouldn't want to do that, but then it also stops making sense to do it as an extension block. So Indeed. It's sort of kind of a way of skirting around an issue, basically, by just making it optional and opt-in.
Yeah. So if we've sort of concluded on the ZK-SNARK, do you have any other areas or ideas you want to knock around or want to bring up or discuss?
Well, there's one thing, I guess, that you mentioned that hasn't come up yet, which is you asked me about the Zendu protocol.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah. The Zendu. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the story there? What's the story there?
So, so what we've been talking about thus far is that these zero knowledge proofs have, in order to create them within a blockchain, you have to do it as an extension block where all the data still has to go inside of the chain.
Yeah.
And Zendu actually came up with a way to avoid having to put all the data on chain, which is interesting. It's not necessarily perfect, but it was something that was novel to me. And, this also kind of goes back to what we've been talking about. Like, I think most of these altcoins are just nonsense and they're useless and worthless, but every now and then something pops up that there's an interesting concept there. So with Zendu, it's the same story, where Zendu is an altcoin. I don't even know exactly, like, they have like 2 chains and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's confusing to me. I don't care. I'm not interested. But I have to give them credit for coming up with something that was, at least to me, novel. And I do think someone linked me to a paper of some prior art. Like, so maybe even their idea is not like, it's not them that came up with it. But anyway, I don't really care. It's an interesting concept. So what they do is basically the issue that you have and the reason why all the data needs to go onto the main chain when you create one of these zero knowledge chains is that you have a data availability issue where if you only prove, so to go back to the chess analogy, right? What you can do is I can give you a hash of the state of the chessboard, and I can prove that the hash is indeed the state of a chessboard. But if I never gave you the chessboard, you cannot continue playing the game because you don't know where all the pieces are. And roughly, you have the same problem if you don't reveal the chessboard. And that's why all the non-witness data, as I called it, all the new outputs that are being created need to go onto the main chain, because otherwise you can't say Absolutely. Like, hey,
yes,
I had some coins here. You only have a hash. The hash is valid, but you don't know what's inside of it. So you can never say, like, I had some coins. You can prove it to no one. So the way the Zendu protocol tries to solve that is they do 2 things. So the first thing is that when, let's say, a chess piece hasn't moved or when a UTXO hasn't been spent, normally what happens is you have a Merkle tree and you have a hash, right? And then something changes in the tree, and now you have a new hash with a new tree. And let's say you had a UTXO in the first tree, it still exists in the second tree, But if you have the proof for the first Merkle tree, you don't have the proof for the second Merkle tree, you can't prove that you have the coins now, right? Do you understand the problem, or should I like?
No, keep going.
Okay, so I'll just rephrase it just to be certain, because it is a little confusing. My point is, you have a Merkle tree, you have a UTXO in the tree, and you have some hashes that point to it.
Right.
So you can prove that your transaction is in there.
Yes.
Now the state of the tree gets updated. So we go from state 1 to state 2.
Yeah.
And one transaction here, not your transaction, but somebody else's transaction changed.
So the tree has changed.
The tree has changed, so your proof has changed. So you can't use your old proof for the new state.
Right.
And so the way they solve it is through a bit field. So basically, let's say it's a tree of 4 transactions. And your transaction is the first one, and the transaction that changed is the 4th one. So when they update the state from the first hash to the second hash,
yes,
they just also show 0001, meaning the 4th transaction changed. And the first transaction didn't change.
Okay.
And so now you can use the proof, and with the zero knowledge proof, you actually prove that bit field is correct, right? So you know that 0001 is indeed correct. So the first 3 outputs didn't change, and the 4th output did change. Everybody can verify that.
So that's also part of the zero knowledge proof?
That is part of the zero knowledge proof, to prove that without any data that the tree got updated correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now what you have is your old proof is still valid, because even though now you have the new state, you know the first transaction in the new state didn't change. So if you get the first transaction in an older state and you know it didn't change, it's also applicable to the new state.
Okay. So basically, it's almost like a relativity point kind of thing. The way I understand it, the way I'm going to bastardize this, but you can see a tree state, depending on who's looking at this particular state, will have different proofs, but it's just a relative point of view from the perspective of looking at your particular branches of changes. It's just relative. Do you see what I mean?
Not completely, but as long as you understand, I'm happy.
Okay, all right. It's a new concept. It still needs to be distilled, so I'm able to express it in words. I think you did a very good job of expressing that, by the way. Keep going.
Great. Okay, so the point here is just that when we update the state, if your transaction didn't get updated, you don't need to get a new proof.
Yes.
Right. That's the goal here.
That's right. That's fine. I got that.
So what that means is you need to only receive one proof once.
Yeah.
And then you're golden, right? Yeah. As long as you don't spend your UTXO, you have a proof. It's going to be valid forever.
Right.
So the only question is, well, what if they don't give you the proof, right? Because the goal here is like they just put the hash there, they put the bit field there, and they hand you a proof, and now you're good. And even though the state updates, you have your proof, you're happy. But what if they never sent you the proof in the first place? So in order to prevent that, there's basically kind of a challenge response protocol where you go on chain and you say like, hey, give me my proof. I didn't receive my proof. And then they have to respond and say, okay, here you go, here's your proof. And if they don't respond and they don't give you your proof, basically the state reverts to prior to that challenge response period. And now,
okay, keep going.
Yeah. So all the state updates that happened get canceled, and you go all the way back to when they stopped giving you the proof that you asked for on chain through the challenge response protocol.
So does that revert the state of everybody on the chain?
Yes, and what I would argue is that the state never transitioned in the first place.
Yeah,
right? The state just was there.
Yeah, the condition hasn't been.
Yes.
All the rules have not passed to go to the next state.
Yeah.
So it's just a rule add. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So specifically, the challenge response protocol makes sure that either you get your proof or you go back to a state where you didn't need the proof.
Yeah.
Yeah. You had a proof, or like let's say in this case, it's me sending you a transaction. You need the proof. Now you didn't get the proof. Now
Okay.
I have the money again, and you never had the money.
Is this okay? What problem are we solving here from a
So
high level? Is this the longest chain?
No, so the problem we're solving here is we want to avoid putting all the outputs on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Okay, fine.
So
okay.
that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
So we don't put it on the chain, and only when you don't receive it, you have to kind of on-chain challenge them to give it to you.
Sure.
But then as long as they do give it to you, you never have to do that. So it's sort of like a valid, like an assumption where as long as everybody behaves, everything's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the argument that you were referring to that I got into on Twitter was I was arguing with one of their researchers, I guess. I don't even know, but somebody involved in the project. And a nice guy, by the way, he was helpful, but we disagreed on the point of the finality here. So what I was just saying is like, look, if you have a challenge response protocol and it takes 2 to 4 hours, which I think is even short, but okay, then really you don't have consensus until the 2 to 4 hours are over. It's only when you go through that and now you go to the next 2 to 4 hour period that you have another block, so to speak.
Right.
So even though it seems to work and it's sort of an interesting protocol, it is a very slow protocol of which consensus is as slow as the challenge response period.
So, okay, does this coin also have the longest chain principle?
So, well, the thing here is that it is more like the extension block thing, right? So there's no.
Whoa. But does it have a longest chain?
So there is no longest chain. There's just
fine.
there's a checkpoint basically that goes into the Bitcoin blockchain or into whatever blockchain.
Yeah.
And you know that the checkpoint is valid.
Right.
You don't know if all the data is available for the checkpoints. But through the challenge response protocol that we just described, everybody can be certain that they can either get the data or the chain just stops moving. And now that was the last checkpoint.
Sure. Okay. All right. I see.
Yeah. And so
I tend to agree with you actually on that. I tend to agree with you on that.
Well, my point is not that it breaks anything, right? Like, it's not that I'm saying like the whole thing doesn't work. I'm just saying it's slow consensus, which I still think is very interesting. I mean, I thought it was slightly unfortunate that like he didn't acknowledge the point, because I think it's pretty like obvious when you really think about it.
When you're on paid salaries, sometimes you don't want to say something that might rock the boat, mate.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And like, again, to his credit, like he did really answer all my questions and he helped me understand the protocol. So, like I appreciate that. And but yeah, I guess maybe you're just right. But like, that's the kind of thing I find so unfortunate. And that's also the kind of like incentive that is created by like these altcoins that are businesses, right?
Perverted incentives. Yeah.
Where you get things like that. And it's frustrating for me because like I'm interested in the tech and I just want to know like what are the limitations here, right? Where does it stop working? And they never answer that question, right? So you have to like I really had to like probe them and like can it do this? Yes. Can it do this? No. And then figure out like, okay, this is what the constraints are, but I never get a straight answer of like these are the constraints. This is what doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get that from many altcoins. Almost all of them.
I guess that's how it works.
The only people that are sort of like manhandle you are the Bitcoiners that be like, nah.
But like for me, like I had a debate with Munib as well. I don't know if you happen to see that, but
I don't think I did.
Okay, well, yeah. I mean, that got pretty. It got pretty heated, and like I think this was like after the show, but like he said something to me like. How would you like it if I was like super critical about your spacechains protocol? Because I was critical about like his protocol. And my answer was, I would love it. That would be great. Please. I would love some criticism. And I just like, for me, it's like I want to just get to what works and what is true. And like I said earlier, like if there's some protocol that's better than what I came up with, I'm happy too, right? Like the whole point here is moving this forward and getting Bitcoin to be better than it is today. And yeah, it's just I think it's just one of those examples of how the incentives are just perverse, right? And these are the kinds of ways in which you don't get to the truth, right? When people get offended when you point out something negative, rationality goes out the window, right? Like we're not there anymore talking about, hey, there's a problem here. Let's see how we can make it better. No, there's no problem there. No, it works fine. Don't say that. Oh, you are really mean. You know that? Why are you so mean to us? And you get stuff like that. It's like you should be happy that I'm helping you point something out to actually improve it, right? Like that's how I look at it, at least. But yeah, you're right. Different worlds.
I think also there's a very much the Dutch influence of going on there. There's a reason why the Dutch have such great engineers.
Maybe, I don't know.
Probably. Well, I mean, no. I found some of the most hard-nosed people I know on the engineering front are the Dutch. They're very fucking hard-nosed. I like it. I like that. Dude, we've been going for about 3 hours now. Should we wrap this up now?
I think we should wrap this up.
Yeah, okay. I'm actually finding my brain is like sort of reached a critical mass.
For me, I felt sort of I went like this.
Yeah. Oh, did you?
Well, yeah, because it's like, first you have like high energy, and then you're just like down again, and then you sort of find this like it's like when you're past your bedtime, where it's like at first you're tired, and then after a while you're like, actually, like
a second wind.
I gotta keep going. Yeah, exactly. That's how I feel. But no, it's a good time to stop now. We went through a lot, and I thought it was a great show here. We really talked about things that I hadn't really been talking about much. I hit on some very interesting points, and you asked some great questions. So thanks a lot for that. It was really awesome.
Oh, dude, no, thank you so much for your time. How can people contact you, get in touch with you?
So I would say I have a site. It's just a GitHub gist with all my work, which is tiny.cc/Somsen, SOMSEN.
All right.
And that's where most of my work is. And there's a link there also to a Telegram chat, which is t.me/spacechains. And that's just a chat for all of the stuff I've been working on, and even related stuff. Like we talk about other protocols there as well. I have a podcast, Unhashed Podcast, that I did together with 3 other co-hosts, which is a little bit more like less techy, but also some tech there, and just a little bit more chatty and fun. I don't know if you listen to it, but it's a fun show. And secretly, everybody loves the podcast, but nobody wants to admit it because, it's how do I say? It's not the most politically correct podcast.
I love that. I don't like politically correct stuff. Very boring. It's just boring, man.
Sure. Yeah.
So thanks so much. Appreciate it. And
no problem.
All the best, mate.